Public Policy at Rice University. One of the major principles which guides our institute is to serve as a bridge between domestic and foreign policy. Foreign policy no longer starts at the water's edge. In this revolutionary age of information and the global marketplace, foreign policy starts at the local, state, and federal levels of our society. Last year, our inaugural conference addressed foreign policy challenges at the end of the century and focused on the economic reform programs in Russia and China, the future of warfare, and the increasingly important role of culture, ethnicity, and religion in world affairs in the post-Cold War era, all issues with domestic implications. This year, our conference, which has been made possible by the generosity of Gordon and Mary Kane, will focus on three major domestic issues. First, urban crime and violence, one of the most pressing challenges America faces. Second, the devolution of governance from the federal to the state and local levels, a major trend which will determine our country's ability to meet some of the critical challenges we face in our daily lives as citizens, the future of our cities, our schools, and our social safety net. And third, tax policy issues and possible alternatives to the current system, such as a consumption-based tax. Tax policy, as we heard this morning from Jack Kemp, is a key determinant of economic growth and job creation. Tax reform will have a major impact on our society for years, perhaps decades to come. Another major principle of the Baker Institute is to serve as a bridge between the world of ideas and action. The participants in our conference represent the best from both worlds of scholars and practitioners. This morning, we heard an excellent presentation by Jack Kemp. Shortly after noon today, we will have the privilege of hearing Attorney General Janet Reno on the issues of urban crime and violence. This evening, the honorary chairman of our institute, James A. Baker, will be the keynote speaker at the annual conference dinner. Another key tenet of the Baker Institute is that we are closely integrated with the faculty and student body at Rice University. I am proud to say that our three panels at this year's conference are chaired by distinguished members of Rice University's faculty. Dr. Lee Brown, who is a professor of sociology at Rice and a senior fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. He has served in some of the most important government positions in the law enforcement field. Professor Robert Stein, the Dean of the School of Social Sciences and a leading scholar on urban issues, and Professor George Zodro, the chair of the Economic Department in the School of Social Sciences and a prominent expert on tax issues. You can see in your program notes that our panelists are all individuals who have distinguished themselves in their respective fields, and we thank them all for participating in our annual conference. We are most appreciative that John Engler, the governor of Michigan, John Norquist, the mayor of Milwaukee, and Governor Bill Hobby of Texas have taken the time from their very busy schedules to be in this afternoon's panel on the devolution of governance. I also want to thank two of our nation's top police officials, Matt Rodriguez and Charles Moose, who have gone to great lengths to be with us today. Unfortunately, two of our scheduled panelists could not be with us at the last moment. Dr. DeLulio of Princeton University, because of a death in the family, and Deputy Secretary Larry Summers, who has to be in Washington because of budget meetings called by President Clinton. However, I am pleased to announce that John Holmes, the Harris County District Attorney, will serve in Dr. DeLulio's place on the Urban Crime and Violence panel. In conclusion, we can look forward to what I am sure will be an interesting discussion on these key domestic issues with a view toward lending a meaningful voice to our nation's debate and dialogue on these domestic challenges. It is now my privilege and honor to introduce to you the president of Rice University, a key player in the internationalization of Rice University and the development of the James A. Baker Institute for Public Policy, Dr. Malcolm Gillis.
Good morning y muy buenos días. Welcome to Rice University for the second annual conference of the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy. Next year, God willing, we will meet in a gleaming new building to house the Baker Institute and the departments of economics and political science. I'll see you there. And for our visitors, while your days will be filled with matters of considerable import, we hope that you will have the time to wander around the rest of our campus and explore some of its singular beauty. We're indebted indeed to Secretary Baker and Ambassador Jurigian and Professors Brown and Stein and Zodro and the staff of the Baker Institute for advancing Rice University's leadership in addressing the critical issues facing this nation and the world at large. Last year we met on this site for the inaugural conference to focus on foreign policy challenges at the end of the century. This year, our attention is directed toward equally important domestic matters. As a nation, we have a lot to celebrate and a lot to be proud about as the century draws to a close. But we also have many causes for concern. Last week, fewer than half, 47%, of individuals eligible to vote did so. This kind of apathy begets cynicism. Cynicism begets declining respect for lives and property, and this begets other social problems. In cities across the country, disaffected youth are finding enfranchisement only in street gangs. Since 1995, across the Sun Belt, African American churches have been torched by craven night riders, recalling some of the darkest days of our history after Reconstruction. In the heartland of our country in Oklahoma City, an unspeakable act of terrorism, once held unthinkable on American soil, has shocked us all to the core. Growing dissatisfaction with our tax system has sparked new demands for drastic, truly drastic simplification of our income tax. And it has also sparked growing sentiment for consumption-based taxes, items that will be covered tomorrow morning. The topics to be addressed during this conference go to the heart of these concerns. Thoughtful specialists will examine urban crime and violence, the devolution of government functions, and tax reform and economic policy reform. While some presidential candidates are fond, inordinately so, of references to building bridges to the 21st century, our task is both more prosaic and more immediate. Because, as Ambassador Jurigian has reminded us, the Baker Institute seeks to build bridges between the world of ideas and the world of action, to connect what we believe with what we do. We've been joined, fortunately, by two keynote speakers who understand perfectly this connection between ideas and action, and both are distinguished for their respective contributions to equal opportunity and to equal justice under the law. Long before this most recent presidential campaign, Jack Kemp stood above many of his colleagues in his advocacy of unfettered economic opportunity for all citizens. His vision of America has never been defined by border patrols and barricades designed to keep out other people and their goods and services. Rather, he understands that this country has worked best when our policies have been the most inclusive and when we have enabled men and women of all races to fully partake in the fruits of economic development and growth. In her tenure as Attorney General, Janet Reno has rededicated the resources of the Justice Department toward the protection of the most vulnerable segment of our society, the young. As Secretary Kemp noted, too many children in too many cities grow up believing that their only choice is either to participate in violence or be its victim. This Attorney General has been front and center in responding to threats from children from all sides, be they from drug dealers or from terrorists. The men and the women, scholars and policymakers, who will participate in our panels have been similarly purposeful in their fields. Their words and experiences will find this conference and this university to be hospitable to their ideas and respectful of actions growing from them. Welcome again to Rice University.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. We're now going to proceed with the panelists coming on stage for the panel on urban crime and violence. I'll ask our panelists to come on stage now. I would like to introduce the chair of this panel, Dr. Lee Brown. Lee is the Radoslav Tsanov Professor of Public Affairs in the Sociology Department at Rice University, and I'm proud to say a senior scholar at the Baker Institute. Prior to joining the Rice faculty, he served as director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. He served as New York City Police Commissioner and as Police Chief of Houston from 1982 to 1990. And as Atlanta's Public Safety Commissioner in 1978-1982. He received his doctorate in criminology, a master's in criminology, and a bachelor's in criminology from the University of California at Berkeley. He also earned a master's in sociology from San Jose State University. Indeed, Lee represents exactly what the Baker Institute is about, a scholar and a practitioner. Lee Brown.
Thank you and good morning to everyone. I want to add my voice of welcome to all of you to the Baker Institute's second annual conference, one that will deal with critical issues as we prepare to enter into a new century. And I want to particularly welcome you to our first panel. The subject matter of our discourse this morning could not be any more timely, could not be any more important to the future of America. Why? Because we will be addressing the issue of urban crime and violence. When we explore the issues facing America today, perhaps no other constellation of public concern exceeds that of public safety, drugs and crime and violence and gangs. Even though our official crime statistics tell us that crime is going down, that violence is going down, Americans are still afraid, impelled by popular perception that our streets are, in fact, unsafe, that criminals are becoming more vicious and more violent, that the crimes committed by our young people or those associated with the drug trade are increasingly more random and senseless. Americans are demanding that steps be taken to restore order and reduce the fear they are currently experiencing. The importance of this critical issue is evident by the debate in the political arena, where drugs, crime, and violence have all become a focal point of the American polity. With all due respect for the institution that I spent a lifetime serving, working in, there's a strong dissatisfaction with the ability of government to maintain a sense of public order. There's indeed a crisis of public confidence in the criminal justice system. And although a host of opinions, proposals, and initiatives have been offered as potential remedies, there appears to be little consensus as to government's most effective and efficient response to the array of crime problems facing our great nation. Competing theories concerning the etiology of crime continue to abound, and each entails some specific policy implications. Various scholars, researchers, practitioners, and politicians have championed these perspectives, and each respectively vies for the recognition and advancement of his or her own position. Debates as to the extent and dimensions of crime also proliferate, fueling further debate and underscoring the need for additional information and further research. Each of these opinions and proposals and theories and strategies also derive from a particular base of ideological assumptions, requiring that their implications be taken into account, and the practicality of each is further constrained by a variety of political, social, economic, and infrastructure realities. Despite the diversity of opinion and the amount of dialogue these issues engender, our nation's crime problems continue to be complex and elusive phenomena whose abatement defies simple solution. But we're very fortunate this morning to have a very distinguished panel of scholars and practitioners to help us think through this critically important problem. And my role today is to serve as the moderator of this panel. So let me begin by introducing the panel members. A more detailed biography is in the program, so I will not duplicate that. On my immediate far left, we have Dr. Elliott Curry. And Dr. Curry is a well-known author and a member of the faculty at the University of California at Berkeley. And next to Dr. Curry, we have Dr. Onwuachi-Saunders, a medical epidemiologist with the Centers for Disease Control and currently on loan to the city of Philadelphia, where she serves as Deputy Health Inspector, working with the issue that brings us here today. And next to Dr. Saunders, we have Matt Rodriguez, who's the police superintendent for the city of Chicago. He's also the president of the Major City Police Chiefs Association, representing the chiefs of the largest cities in this country and Canada. And next to Superintendent Rodriguez is Dr. Charles Moose, who is a police chief for the city of Portland, Oregon, and also a leader in the area of implementing effectively community policing. And next is Mr. John B. Holmes, who is our district attorney here for Harris County. And I want to give special thanks to Mr. Holmes for being with us today. Dr. John D'Elio was supposed to be with us, but he informed us late yesterday afternoon that because of a death in his family, he was unable to make it. And when I called Mr. Holmes late yesterday afternoon to ask him to join us on this panel, he immediately agreed to do so. Our district attorney is a native Houstonian. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin and his law degree from the University of Houston. He started off as an assistant district attorney for Harris County in 1969. And he served as our district attorney since 1979, obviously getting elected over and over and over again. Mr. Holmes is a member of a number of professional organizations, and I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with him for a number of years when I served as police chief here, and I can say without any reservation, he is one of the most dedicated and professional prosecutors in this country, bar none. So please join me in welcoming our panel. After the panelists have finished their remarks, we will take written questions from the audience. Those of you with questions, please raise your hand, and we'll have someone collect your questions from you. If you wish to direct your question to a specific panelist, also please be sure to indicate that desire on your question. We will start our presentation this morning with Dr. Curry.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Lee, for your introductory remarks. You know, I always get a little bit nervous when I am introduced at a gathering like this because you never know what people might say about you. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference of about this size. The conference was about drugs, and the fellow who introduced me at that conference said that I'd had a fair amount of experience with this issue. He pointed out that I'd recently written a book about drugs, which was true. Pointed out that I'd done about 2 years' worth of interviews with juvenile delinquents who were drug abusers and serious drug dealers, which was also true. He pointed out also that I had spent a couple of years working in the drug treatment business, which was also true. In fact, he concluded, it appears as though Dr. Curry has spent the better part of the last 10 years on drugs. To which my panicky response, of course, was, how did he find out? Well, what I'd like to do today is to take stock of where we stand with respect to violent crime, to consider some of our record of our recent efforts to control it, and to suggest some priorities for the future. Now, let me just quickly anticipate my conclusions. We are in somewhat better shape when it comes to serious violent crime in America than we were a few years ago. But we're not in good shape by any measure. Since the early 1970s, we have quintupled the number of Americans behind bars. But our country is a more dangerous place now than before we started. And that's especially true for our young people, who are far more endangered than their counterparts in every other industrial democracy. We might be able to reduce the crime rate, some, if we make even more massive investments in incarceration than we already have, and many people believe we should do that. But I think those reductions would come at great cost to our values as well as our pocketbooks. And most importantly, they will come at the expense of our ability to do other things, which, on the evidence, would reduce crime more effectively. The alternative, and there is one, is to shift the balance by restoring proportion to our criminal justice policies and by making the social investments, both inside and outside the justice system, that we've badly neglected over the past 2 decades. Let me just remind you of the magnitude of our prison explosion in recent years. In 1970, we had fewer than 200,000 inmates in our prisons. At last count, we had passed 1.1 million. If you add in local jails, the total goes up over 1.6 million. 1.6 million, by the way, is close to the total population of the city of Houston proper, not the metro area, but the city of Houston. So if you want to visualize what 1.6 million inmates means, think of the entire population of the city of Houston behind bars on any given day. Now, it's crucial to understand that this wasn't just a case of a besieged prison system racing to keep up with rising crime. We were indeed increasing the chances that if you committed a crime, you would go behind bars. The average prison time served per violent crime in the United States roughly tripled between 1975 and 1989, mainly because offenders were more likely to go behind bars at all if they committed a crime, in part because they were likely to stay behind bars longer once they were sent. And in many states, of course, prison populations shot up even faster than they did nationally. Here in Texas, for example, the prison population more than doubled according to the statistics from 1990 to 1995 alone. The increase in the number of inmates in the state of Texas during those years, those 5 years, about 67,000, is considerably larger than the entire prison population of England and Wales. And we all know what this explosion has meant for some communities. Today, roughly 1 in 3 young black men across the country is under the supervision of the criminal justice system. The figure is 2 out of 5 in California. In California, we have 41,000 black men in our state prisons, and we have about 10,000 black men in our state colleges and universities. 4 times as many in prison as in college or university. The prison, in other words, has taken on a role in our society that is unparalleled in our history, or in fact in the history of any other industrial democracy. This has probably been the most thoroughly implemented government social program in anybody's memory, short of a major war. Unlike other government programs, I think it's reasonable to ask what we've gotten in return. And let me be clear. There is a lot of legitimate dispute about this. People of goodwill can argue and do argue about the precise impact of incarceration on crime rates. But the legitimate dispute takes place within very narrow boundaries. And I believe that the bottom line is that we have accomplished very little at very great cost. The good news, as Lee Brown pointed out in his remarks, is that there has been an overall decline in violent crime in the country as a whole since about 1992. It's been a sharp decline in some cities. The bad news is, first of all, that the decline follows even larger rises in the years just before. So if we look at a longer time frame, we see no decline at all. Nationally, rates of violent crime peaked around 1991. Since then, through 1995, the number of homicides has fallen by about 13%. That's good. But it follows a rise of about 32% from 1984 to 1991, one of the fastest increases in lethal violence in our recent history. Reported robberies have fallen by about 16% since 1991, but that follows a 42% rise since 1984. What the numbers tell us, in short, is that we have offset that 1991 peak in violence and returned to where we stood in the late 1980s. But that was not a good place to be. And when we look farther back in time, at certain kinds of places, things look, in fact, much grimmer. I've been looking at city homicide rates lately, and what I've seen is very startling. Let's go back for a moment, just about a quarter century, to the days before we began our massive experiment in incarceration. And let's look at changes in homicide rates. That is, the number of murders relative to city population, from 1970 through 1995. There is some modestly good news in these numbers. Boston's homicide rate fell by about 3% in these years, San Francisco's by 13%, but there is also a lot of stunningly bad news in these figures. Murder was up about 70% in Los Angeles in this period, over 80% in Phoenix, over 90% in Oakland, 90% in Memphis. Homicide more than doubled in Washington, D.C., in Birmingham, in Richmond, in Jackson, Mississippi. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Rochester, New York, homicide rates exploded by more than 200% in those years. In Minneapolis, by over 300%. In the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, if my calculations aren't wrong, the homicide rate rose in those years by a stunning 329%. Let's pause on that one for a minute. The state of Louisiana was always a tough state, and by the end of this period, it led every state in the Union, except Texas, in its imprisonment rate, which was 5 times higher in the mid-1990s than it was at the beginning of the 1970s. But if you lived in New Orleans, you were more than 4 times as likely to die by violence at the end of that period than at the beginning. And these explosive rises in homicide, in the face of these equally explosive rise in imprisonment, also took place despite some things that should have lowered rates of violence. For example, they took place in the face of improvements in the medical response to trauma that should, other things equal, have lowered crime rates, death rates rather. And they took place despite the well-known decline in the proportion of youth in the population that also should have lowered these rates. But other things were not equal, and instead we both had fewer young people and far more youth violence. Again, in the last 2 years, we've seen finally some modest decreases in youth violence, but so far, all they've done is to take the edge off the earlier devastating rises, which brought many cities the highest rates of youth homicide that they had ever had in their history in the early 1990s. Nationally, between 1987 and 1992, the homicide death rate among young American men aged 15 to 24 rose by 2/3 in those few years. The figure was 37 per 100,000, and that's a very abstract number. To put it into perspective, consider that the comparable rate for British youth in 1992 was 0.7 per 100,000, 37 versus 0.7. By the early 1990s, in other words, a young American male was over 50 times as likely to die by deliberate violence as his English counterpart, 28 times as likely as a young Frenchman, over 90 times as likely as a young Japanese, assuming, of course, that the Japanese was smart enough to stay in Japan. This, then, is the state of violence in America's inner cities after 2 decades of the most intensive investment in incarceration of violent criminals that anyone anywhere has ever seen. And what's most striking about these numbers is that they show not only that our prison experiment has had less impact than its promoters expected, but even less than its critics expected, including this critic. A lot of criminologists have been arguing for a long, long time that we can't really incarcerate our way out of our violent crime problem, but most of us never suggested that massive increases in imprisonment would have no effect on the crime rate. Most of us believed in particular that there was indeed such a thing as what criminologists call an incapacitation effect, meaning that if enough offenders are simply taken off the streets, then you're going to have some drop in at least some kinds of crime, especially what we call high-rate offenses like burglary and robbery. But what many of us argued was that the effect would be disturbingly small relative to the investment. And what's startlingly clear today is that if anything, we erred on the positive side. We boosted the incarceration rate by much more than anyone ever imagined that we would. But we got no overall decrease in serious criminal violence. We got substantial increases in many places, including many of the places that incarcerated the most or that increased their rates of imprisonment the fastest. And we also got that horrifying upward spike in youth violence, which turned our cities into killing fields for the young and poor just when we were putting more and more of the young and poor behind bars already. So why? Why did we see so little impact from the extraordinary increases in imprisonment? Well, I think the answer is complicated, and it's not all in. But parts of it seem clear. Some of it involves inherent limitations of imprisonment as a crime-reducing strategy that criminologists have been talking about for many years. One is that imprisoning offenders cannot, by definition, prevent the crime that got them imprisoned in the first place. Another is what criminologists sometimes call a replacement effect, meaning that putting a drug dealer or a youth gang member, for example, in prison may simply open up a position for someone else in an ongoing enterprise rather than reducing the overall rate of crime. But even more important, I suspect, is that the vast increases in imprisonment took place simultaneously with a sharp deterioration in the social conditions of the people and the communities that are most at risk of violent crime. So that while we were busily flooding our prisons with young poor men, we were simultaneously generating the fastest increase in income inequality in our recent history. We were tolerating the descent of several million Americans, most of them children, into poverty. An American child was half again as likely to be poor in 1993 as 20 years earlier. And poor children were increasingly likely to spend a long stretch of their childhood, if not all of it, below the poverty line. At the same time, we cut many of the public supports that could have cushioned the impact of poverty and economic insecurity on families and communities. And we cut some of the rungs on our already wobbly ladders out of poverty. Federal spending on jobs and job training for low-income people, for example, dropped by half during the 1980s. Meanwhile, between 1980 and 1993, federal spending on correctional activities, that's prisons, rose by 521% in current dollars. So we created communities without stable jobs, without preventive health care, without school counselors, without recreation facilities, with staggeringly inadequate mental health and child protective services. And all of this, of course, was enormously aggravated by the crack cocaine epidemic and by the flood of guns that often followed it into the cities. And in fact, the waning of the crack epidemic almost certainly helps explain the recent short-term declines in violent crime in many cities. But the crack and gun explosions in the inner cities didn't come from nowhere. They were bred by the same declining opportunities, the same erosion of socialization and support, and the same shattering of hope and community in our cities. And so the stubbornness of violent crime in the face of these rapidly mounting prison numbers wasn't really terribly surprising. We were, in effect, trying to use our prisons to contain a growing social crisis in America, a crisis that was concentrated among the bottom quarter of our population. The prisons became, in a very real sense, a substitute for the more constructive social policies that we were avoiding. The prison was what we had instead of an anti-poverty policy. It's what we had instead of an employment policy. It's what we had instead of a comprehensive drug treatment or mental health policy. Now, that, of course, is not the only take on the experience of the last 25 years, and in fact, you will often hear a different story. You will hear that the prison experiment has been an enormous success. It's sometimes argued, for example, that although it's true that violent crime remains intolerably high, it would have been a lot worse had it not been for the prison boom. So that all we really need to do is more of the same. By incarcerating a lot of the people that we now put on probation, for example, by cracking down harder on juvenile offenders and putting more of them behind bars, preferably in adult prisons. But the argument doesn't work very well for two reasons. The first is that it just doesn't really fit our historical experience. There have been some very elaborate studies trying to prove, in fact, that there is a strong relationship between our present prison population growth and the crime rate. Some of them, in fact, do claim to have found a significant impact of prison population growth on crime. Some of them, in other words, do claim to show that without the prison boom, we would have had higher rates of crime. But they don't find that for most violent crimes, just as we expected 20 years ago. The biggest impact of the huge increases in imprisonment we've seen in the last 20 years has been on property crimes. It's crimes like burglary, like larceny. The only violent crime that has been consistently found in these studies to have been significantly affected by the growth of imprisonment is robbery. And again, that's what we expected, because robbery is what we call a high-rate crime, and it's reasonable to assume that if you catch one robber, that robber may in fact commit a lot of crimes when out on the street. But even for robbery, the estimates, even the most positive ones, are really pretty sobering. One recent study, for example, estimates that the huge increases in imprisonment during the 1980s may have reduced robberies by about 18% from what they would have been otherwise. 18%. Virtually no reduction in murder or assault, maybe a tiny reduction in rape, but very, very little. But there's a second problem with this argument. It's even more serious. Making the claim that crime would have been much, much worse in the absence of our prison boom tacitly assumes that the alternative to that prison boom was to do nothing. But in fact, of course, doing nothing was never on anybody's crime control agenda. So if you want to argue that things would have been worse without the prison boom, you have to ask, compared to what? The argument, in other words, requires us to believe not only that violent crime would have been worse had we made no intervention at all, which may be true, but also that it would have been worse had we done the kinds of things that many criminologists said we should do before the prison boom even began, but which, in fact, for the most part, we did not do. And here the argument crumbles very quickly, for not only is there no evidence to support it, but there is compelling evidence, in fact, against it. Here, of course, we encounter another unfortunate myth that's come to prominence in the American debate about crime. And that's the myth that there are no credible alternatives to what we are now doing. That prevention programs, for example, are just pork. That rehabilitation of offenders cannot work. That improving opportunities for the young won't reduce crime. And if that's true, then even if jamming more and more people into prison isn't very effective and is very costly, and likely to bring us diminishing returns in the future, then it's our only realistic option. I think this is a terribly destructive myth. It's helped to condemn thousands of our young people to injury, to premature death, and to wasted lives every year. But it's also wrong. In fact, what is astonishing when you look carefully at the record of some of our most promising prevention programs is how much we can accomplish with relatively little if we're careful about what we do. Now, Dr. Saunders is going to talk more about prevention, but just as a bare beginning, let me just point to 4 things which we know, on the basis of very sound evidence, could make a real difference in terms of violent crime. First, invest serious resources in the prevention of child abuse and neglect. This, after all, is where much of the violent crime that plagues us begins, especially the kinds of violent crime that we fear the most. And we have encouraging evidence that some intensive approaches with high-risk families, especially those that are based on supportive home visiting, can reduce child abuse and neglect, sometimes quite dramatically. As you may know, the state of Hawaii has a statewide program along these lines. It's a particularly promising example. It's backed by careful evaluations of earlier child abuse prevention programs, which have made a striking difference in rates of child abuse and neglect, often with a very modest investment of resources. Second, expand early intervention programs for children who are at high risk of failure in school at early ages. Again, the why of this is quite easy. We know that kids who can't make it in school are disproportionately likely to be the ones who wind up in our reformatories and prisons. But there is now wide agreement that well-designed programs, along the lines, for example, of the well-known Perry preschool program in Michigan, can change that trajectory. The Perry Project, in that project, kids were enrolled in preschool for a few hours a day. Their teachers visited their homes, visited their parents for about 1.5 hours a week. worked with the parents on a variety of child-rearing issues. The evaluation of this program has now followed the children through age 27. And the students who went through the Perry program are now far more likely to be working and earning a decent living, and literate and off the dole, and they were only one-fifth as likely to have been repeatedly arrested as a carefully matched control group of kids who didn't go through that program. Third, a little farther down the road, invest in intensive programs at the middle school level and the high school level to build young people's skills and keep them on track towards higher education and training. There is a fashionably pessimistic belief that by the age of 6 or maybe by the age of 3, children are set in their path and there's not a whole lot that we can do to change things. But that's a dangerous exaggeration. The strongest recent evidence we have on this comes from a program called the Quantum Opportunity Program, which was designed to help high school-age youth from welfare homes in several sites around the country. The kids stayed in this program for 4 years. They got substantial skills training in addition to regular schooling. They did community service work. They were given a small stipend as an incentive while they were in the program, which was matched dollar for dollar by money that was put into a fund that they could use later for college or for advanced training. 2 years after this program began, the average number of arrests for participants in the Quantum program was about half that of a control group. Fourth, we also need to build on successful programs for youth who are already in trouble, early in their career of offending. Here again, the need is obvious and it's glaring. Our response now to kids who get in trouble is often either too harsh or too negligent, or perhaps both at the same time. What we do is we let kids get in trouble over and over again, sometimes without seriously addressing the problems that got them in trouble in the first place. And then we get frustrated at some point and throw the book at them, and they wind up in prison for the rest of their days. There are better ways to do this. There is an approach, for example, called multi-systemic therapy, which is a very cumbersome sort of jaw-breaking phrase for what's really a common-sense program. A program in Missouri and South Carolina, for example, hired trained caseworkers to work very intensively, up to several meetings a week, with young offenders, many of whom had committed very serious, often very violent crimes, and would otherwise have been on their way to a youth prison. The idea was to address problems that came up in every realm of the kid's life, especially the family, school, healthcare, and so on. Whatever the problem was, let's fix it before we let this kid go. In the Missouri program, delinquents who completed the program had less than a third the rearrest rate over the following 4 years of those who had gone through more conventional juvenile justice programs. If they were rearrested, it was for less violent crimes and for less serious crimes. Now, all of these more successful efforts have a lot in common. There are more of them, by the way, not just 4, but those are 4 that I think we have the best evidence on. They have a lot in common. They're preventive, not just reactive. They build on the strengths and capacities of young people and their families, rather than just treating their deficiencies. They're comprehensive, in that they go beyond the individual who's at risk to tackle the conditions in the family and community that put them at risk in the first place. And they are cost-effective. The Quantum Opportunity Program costs about $2,500 a year per participant. The Perry Preschool Program is estimated to have paid back about $7 for every dollar that was invested in it. Now, I'm not suggesting that these programs are all that we need in a comprehensive strategy against violent crime. And this isn't the place for a more detailed blueprint, and other panelists want to talk about that, but let me just point to 3 other things very quickly that I'm convinced ought to be very, very high on our agenda as we move toward the 21st century. 1 involves the criminal justice system specifically. 2 involve broader social policies. The first is that we should increase our investment in the most promising police crime prevention strategies. Since we have several real experts on that up here, I'm going to keep my mouth shut on this for the most part, but let me just make a couple of points. Criminologists used to think that there was very little that the police could do to prevent crime. That conclusion was actually based on very sparse evidence, mainly from studies of the effects of variations in conventional patrol tactics. But we now have very intriguing and encouraging signs that what these guys do may matter a great deal. I think that's especially true for strategies to get guns off the streets, where the research evidence, I think, is very, very strong and very encouraging. Many people believe that assertive, problem-oriented policing is responsible for at least some of the sharp declines of crime we've seen in some cities, notably New York City and also here in Houston. But we need to know more, in particular, more about which of the many things the police are doing in these cities that can take the credit. But my bet is that we will achieve much greater reductions in crime by improving and spreading the most effective police practices than by further marginal increases in the number of people we put behind bars. Two initiatives at the level of broader social policy also rank very high on my list of priorities. Both involve reversing the downward spiral in our communities that has fueled the explosive rise in youth violence. First, any credible anti-crime strategy for the next century has to be linked to a strong package of family support policies. Everybody across the political spectrum agrees that families are critical, that what happens in families helps mightily to determine whether our children grow up compassionate or predatory, moral or irresponsible. And yet, as a society, we clearly seem to want to have it both ways. We want competent, caring families that can do a good job of raising and supervising their kids. But we balk when it comes to providing the means that could make that possible. We force many parents to choose between draining overwork in the low-wage, unstable economy and demoralizing poverty outside it. We want parents to work, but we balk at providing the child care that would allow them to do so without jeopardizing the socialization of their children. We want parents to spend quality time with their children, but we refuse to mandate the paid work leaves or the shorter hours that would make it possible. And then we blame families for the consequences. We increasingly recognize the link between the abuse and neglect of children and the growth of violent crime, but we starve our child protective systems. In the future, I think we're going to have to choose between perpetuating the kinds of family stresses that we know breed violence, or finally bringing our family policies into line with those of most other industrial democracies, which, not coincidentally, also suffer a lot less violent crime than we do. Second, relatedly, I think a successful anti-crime policy must be linked to a serious employment policy. As Mr. Kemp emphasized this morning, there is a continuing depression in our inner cities. And yet each year brings us new evidence on the powerful links between economic marginality and joblessness and violent crime. I'm convinced that the most important single measure that we could take to bring long-term reductions in violent crime in our cities would be a permanent investment in publicly funded job creation, especially jobs in childcare, child protection, public safety, healthcare, and in the training and support services to go with them. To a criminologist, what's most appealing about this strategy is that it will accomplish two crucial things at the same time. It would provide the kind of steady, meaningful work, the kind of economic opportunity that could draw youth out of the drug trade, that could strengthen families, that could stabilize communities. And at the same time, it could provide trained people to staff the kinds of prevention programs for children, youth, and families that I've just described. But here too, however, we seem to want contradictory things. We say we want people to work, and we want them to work in the legitimate labor market. But we also deliberately maintain unnaturally high levels of joblessness for the young in our cities, partly because we're afraid that full employment will raise wages and therefore hurt the stock and bond markets. But we simply cannot have it both ways. We also have a rather long tradition of ideological resistance to public job creation. We say it isn't government's business to provide jobs, it's the private sector's business. Except, of course, that we have in many states, including this one, a very, very big public job program that nobody complains about and everybody, in fact, wants a piece of. It's called prisons. And again, I think we have to be more honest with ourselves and more consistent. If it's okay to spend public money to hire people to work in prisons, it's got to be okay to spend public money to hire people to work in health clinics. I think these strategies, by the way, will become even more critical in our new era of welfare reform, as states struggle to find new ways to meet the mandate to put welfare recipients to work. The right way to approach this challenge is to invest heavily and creatively in job creation, coupled with generous provision for child care. If we don't do that, watch out. We will surely increase the risks of violence in low-income communities, both in the street and in the home. We all know that the nation's youth population will increase substantially over the next several years. Here in Texas, you're expected to have 300,000 more kids under 18 by the year 2000 and 700,000 more kids under 18 by the year 2010. And I think it behooves us to think hard about what kinds of families we want those young people to grow up in and about how much stress and deprivation in the lives of those children we are willing to tolerate in the name of reform. Well, there's much more to be said, but let me conclude on a note of some urgency. I really believe today, and I've been studying these things for longer than I care to tell you, but I really believe that today we stand at a fork in the road. We can continue along the path that we've taken, depending more and more on our penal system to contain the consequences of systematic social neglect. Or we can begin to make the social investments that would mean less need for a swollen prison system in the first place, and make them on the level that we know they need to be made. Now, at this point, some people will say, well, why can't we do both? Why can't we build a lot more prisons and put a lot more money into job creation, child protection, family support? Well, if that idea sounds familiar, it should. It is the civilian version of the old Vietnam-era fallacy that we could afford both guns and butter. That fallacy helped bring us the urban social crisis and the bulging prisons that we suffer today. Make no mistake about it, there is already a crippling tension in our society between our spending on incarceration and on other social needs. We see it every day in my state. It is not simply a matter of chance that we have opened 1 college and 21 prisons in California since 1984. There's no free lunch. We really do need to make choices. And let's be very clear on what those choices are. There is simply no serious debate about whether we should be incarcerating repeat violent offenders for a long time. But we already do that, with some exceptions. The real debate is about balance. The balance between what we invest in prisons and what we invest elsewhere, including in the police. The balance between simply boosting the number of people behind bars versus improving the chances for successful reentry into society for those who we do put there. And these aren't just technical issues. The debate is also about values, about which ways of combating crime best express our deepest beliefs, best express our strongest social vision. Let me put to you a little thought experiment. Just suppose it's now the year 2005, and we have indeed doubled our national prison and jail population once again. As a result, we now have well over 3 million Americans behind bars on any given day. Our national imprisonment rate is now 10 times that of our nearest competitors among industrial democracies, rather than just 5 as it is now. The proportion of young black men under correctional supervision has risen from 32% to, let's say, 45 or 50%, over 2 out of 3 in some cities. And now suppose that by doing all of this, we had indeed managed to cut rates of serious offenses by about 15%. How do you feel about that? Do you celebrate? Do you break out the champagne at this point? Well, I doubt it. Why not? Why wouldn't we celebrate? I think it's because we would feel intuitively that something was terribly wrong with our society if we had to resort to the confinement of such a large proportion of our population. And also because we would know deep down that there were better ways to reduce violent crime. We would know, in other words, that we could have done it differently had we chosen. Most importantly, we could have done it by investing in the potential of a great many young people who we instead will have simply thrown away. We would realize, in short, that we had abandoned one vision of our society, one vision of our potential, and replaced it with a lesser one. And we'd find very little to celebrate in that. Because finally, in any civilized society, what matters is not just whether we reduce crime, but how we reduce crime. And how seriously and honestly we put that question on the agenda in the coming years will be a test of our character as a nation. Thank you very much.
We want to thank Dr. Curry for this very thoughtful presentation. And our next panelist will be Dr. Saunders.
Good morning. I'm going to speak more to you about a solution to the problems that Dr. Curry has presented to you. I think most of you in the room are aware of the fact that the numbers of young people that are dying in the country as a result of violent behavior has risen dramatically. As he pointed out to you, fortunately, we can say that the numbers are beginning to decline, but that's after a precipitous increase that we saw in 1984. Excuse me, 1984. And what happened, my particular experience is that the health commissioner in the city of Philadelphia declared that violence among youth was an emergency for him, actually a public health emergency, and asked the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to dispatch someone to the city to help him deal with that issue. And I went to Philadelphia back in 1992. If you don't know it, Philadelphia is the 5th largest city in the United States. We're approximately 1.6 million people. And we are ethnically or racially diverse. We're about 40% African American, 50% white, and we have a fast rising Asian and Latino population. When I went back in 1992 to Philadelphia, the idea was to come up with a community-based approach to violence among young people, but more importantly for me, to use my principles of public health. And public health has always taught us that the response to an issue, the first thing that you do is you collect data, because you want to analyze that data in order to identify potential risk factors or look for enablers or barriers that will prevent people from doing the behavior that you would like them to see. After analyzing that data, you then go on to develop an intervention. And more importantly, you implement that intervention in the community, and then you evaluate whether or not it's made a difference. In Philadelphia, they lose approximately 100 children below the age of 21 to violent behavior every year. Philadelphia has an exceedingly high homicide rate. We lose about 450 people each year to interpersonal violence in the city of Philadelphia. And the city felt that this was alarming, or they felt that it had to stop. So how do you take a problem that you know is extremely complex and devise some sort of framework on which you can place many, many efforts that are going on within a large city like Philadelphia in order to make the numbers of young people that die decrease? What we decided was that there had to be an initiative, and the initiative in the city of Philadelphia is called Operation Peace in Philadelphia. And we call it a community-based, comprehensive, public-private philanthropy, violence prevention, reduction, peace promotion initiative. We tell people we have all the right buzzwords, because it's not until you have everything on the table that you can actually do something about this particular issue. Our vision back in 1992 was that we would promise by the year 2000 that we would significantly increase the amount of people that were dying as a result of violent behavior in the city of Philadelphia, and subsequently, therefore, enhance the quality of life. How we proposed to do that was through a mission statement, which echoes the African proverb that it takes an entire village to raise a child, which we said meant in the city of Philadelphia, how dare you believe it is your right to raise your child by yourself? Collective responsibility is what we need here in order to turn around young people's behavior. And so therefore, even though the initiative was geared toward reducing violence among young people, we said it was necessary for us to establish new ideals, beliefs, and patterns as related to violent behavior among all Philadelphians, not only the young people themselves, because young people derive their behavior from adult behavior. As I was taught that as a young person, your behavior is, or young people are like chalkboards. What you write on them is exactly what you get. And we have got to remember that as an adults. So we felt that we needed to take another approach as it related to reducing interpersonal violence among our young people. We had what you would call principles, which we felt we needed to echo, because many, many communities across the country felt that violence was an overwhelming issue, one that they couldn't do anything about. So the three principles to our principles that we felt were necessary for us to echo was, first of all, that violence among young people is a preventable problem, that you can actually prevent it, but most importantly, that the community must declare that it's unacceptable. Many communities have not declared that, and they need to declare it. Secondly, they have to understand that this prevention, even though many, many arenas across the nation have declared it as an epidemic, that this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. And one of the things that we all know is that it's going to take time to change behavior. And every marathon runner will tell you that it's not that he finishes the race or she finishes the race as first, second, or third, but that they actually finish the race. And that's the thing that people have to understand if they're going to undertake trying to alleviate this particular problem. And the third important aspect is that every segment of the society has a role to play. It's not enough for us to blame any one arena for not doing their work well. We all have responsibility in reducing violence among our young people. So we felt that our initiative had to have three very vital components. And the first component was a collaboration. We decided that we would divide the city into 12 action teams and tell everybody that you had responsibility for alleviating this particular problem. The academic institutions, the businesses, the schools, the young people themselves, the interfaith or the churches or the synagogues, the neighborhoods. Everybody has responsibility. Everyone is responsible for bringing strategies to the table as it relates to alleviating this particular problem. One of the things that my father always taught me was that when you point your finger at someone, remember that 3 fingers are pointing back at you. So what are your solutions going to be? Neighborhoods, bring your solutions. Business, bring your solutions. We all have responsibility here. One of the metaphors, or one of the things that happened interestingly in the city was when we brought the community-based organizations together, they were all speaking about what they do, particularly in their neighborhoods as it relates to drugs. And it was very interesting because West Philadelphia has traditionally led the city in what we consider to be innovative techniques around many of these overwhelming issues that are placed in front of us. And there was a group who came down from North Philadelphia. And as I said, we were speaking about drug trafficking. And this group from North Philadelphia was very proud of themselves because they were successful in getting drug traffickers out of their community. And how they shared with us that they did it was, what they would do is they would go into the house that was on the corner where the gentlemen were trafficking drugs, and they would play gospel music loud. And they were very successful in going into each of these homes on each of these corners, playing this music and getting these people out of their community. And the group from West Philadelphia was surprised because they had never heard of this technique before. And this is what we meant by the fact that it's not until we all bring our strategies together, it's not until we all begin to collaborate that we'll begin to reduce this particular problem. In Philly, we say the analogy is that we're getting ready to have a buffet. And when you're getting ready to have a buffet, you tell someone to bring plates, someone to bring pie, someone to bring the Coke, someone to bring the napkins, someone to bring the turkey. What we're saying is that we're getting ready to have a buffet. We're getting ready to celebrate our children. And what we need is for everybody to bring their strategies to the table. It's not going to be any one arena that is going to be responsible for dealing with this particular issue. The second component is what we call a media awareness campaign, because you have to get out positive messages repeatedly to our young people. The slogan that we coined for our media campaign was, "I hear what you say, but I see what you do. Lead by example." The strategies or the target audience for our particular campaign were specifically adult and adult youth service providers. Because as I said before, we believe that in order to change young people's behavior, we had to change adult behavior. And most importantly, that adults had to realize that they were the problem, but they also could be the solution. So most of the efforts in the city of Philadelphia, as it relates to reducing violence among young people on the citywide level, are directed towards the adults and them taking over their responsibility. Because, believe it or not, it's adult and adult youth service providers that are responsible for maintaining many of the myths and the stereotypes about our young people. And what we have to remember is that when young people engage themselves in negative behavior, it's because something negatively has impacted or has impacted their lives. And we as adults have to understand that. And I always tell people the example of, for instance, I always use Thanksgiving as that example. When you go home for Thanksgiving dinner and you get into a debate about young people, and if you particularly have an uncle who may be a correctional officer, someone who deals directly with adults, when you're talking about back and forth about young people, they will get up and say, "Listen, I know these kids, there's nothing you can do with them, I deal with them every day." And everybody in the room gets quiet. And what we have got to understand is that, as I said before, Young people only engage in negative behavior because negative behavior has impacted them in some form or fashion. And the solutions, of course, may seem difficult for some of us to understand, but they're very, very simplistic. And therefore, the only messages that Operation Peace directs towards young people are so-called recovery-type messages, which say, we love you, we care about you, we even as adults have made mistakes, but what we did was we brushed off our knees, we got back into society, and we tried it again, and that's what you have to do. Because what we have found through research is that many, many of our young people have been bombarded with so-called prevention and retention messages. We tell them stay in school, we tell them don't do drugs, we tell them you must get an education, but we don't tell them enough that we love them, that we care about them, that yes, you can make mistakes and we still will be there for you. Get back in and try it again. And those are the type of messages that Operation Peace only sends to our young people. But as he said before, we work on the messaging that we need to give to adults because it's not until we have collective responsibility that we will turn this particular problem around. The third and most vital component of Operation Peace, even though the other two are just as vital, is data and information. And one of the things that has happened is that we have continuously looked at violent behavior from what I consider to be the tip of the iceberg. We look at the information that is particularly given from only one particular arena, and that's the criminal justice arena, because they are the ones that collect a lot of the information about violent activity in this country. They can tell you the relationship between the victim and the offender. They can tell you the circumstances under which it occurred. They can tell you the methodology that is used, and that's what we have used in prevention to direct our prevention efforts. We need to get more information from multiple arenas, not just one arena that looks at this particular problem. Another arena that could be very vital to us is the medical arena. They see many, many of the people that are injured by this particular activity, which is another cut at the iceberg. So in the city of Philadelphia, what we were successful in doing is declaring weapon-related injuries as a reportable health condition. What happens now is that whenever someone is seen in one of our emergency facilities or in a medical facility and they have been injured by a weapon, that information now has to be reported directly to the health department, just as we now report tuberculosis, HIVs, and even the sexually transmitted diseases, in order to derive the type of prevention strategies that we feel will hopefully alleviate this issue. The other thing that we have done in the city around information gathering is we have taken the death review process to another level. Our Violence Initiative involves a death review process. We now, in the city of Philadelphia, investigate all deaths to young people 21 years and below. There are two teams. One team looks at all the children that die from homicides and suicide. The other one looks at all the young people that die from natural deaths and what we consider to be the unintentional injuries, which are motor vehicle collisions, drownings, and pedestrian mishaps, and so forth. And the idea is to look from multiple perspectives. These are multiple agencies that sit around this table: the district attorney's office, the police, the health department, the schools, community-based organizations, hospitals, and see whether or not this death could have been preventable by the fact that everyone is bringing information as it related to the life of this particular child. As a result of this process, we have put multiple policy issues on our plate as relates to how we can better alleviate the fact that children die, what we need to do differently in the city of Philadelphia. That's information and data. We've learned a lot of lessons, and we've also come up against a lot of obstacles. And there's a proverb that says, if you're building a house and a nail breaks, do you stop building the house or do you change the nail? In Philly, I think we've changed the nail. First of all, many, many people do not believe that violence is preventable. They feel that the only thing you can do is intervene, and that's not true. It is preventable, and we all have to keep saying that and making people understand that. The second thing is that all of you are aware of the fragmentation of delivery service. Many, many of the children that are at high risk for HIV, substance abuse, cigarettes, or even sexually transmitted diseases are the same children that are at high risk for violent behavior. So why is it that they have to go different places to get different things? We've got to get back to holistic health care or comprehensive health care as it relates to these kids and deal with these issues at one time across the board. The last thing that has been a major obstacle is this monolithic view, this simplistic solution to this very, very complex problem. What I tell people is that there's no simple solution to this very, very complex problem, that violence is a very, very complex psychosocial solution that's going to take very, very probably simplistic but very complex solutions as it relates to alleviating it. We've learned some lessons. First of all, that commitment and ownership are necessary. Many of the people that are involved in reducing violence as it relates to young people in the city of Philadelphia have commitment and ownership, and that no one can truly pay them for what they're trying to do. The other thing is that collaboration is extremely hard work. People don't, in many instances, understand the true meaning of collaboration. Collaboration means your success is my success. Your failure is my failure. We're not specifically always speaking about coalitions, but more like collaborations in where we have shared responsibility for the outcomes. We say that in Philadelphia, we're trying to make music out of a lot of noise. And what is going on in many communities is a lot of noise. There are many efforts that are being undertaken as it relates to alleviating violence in their communities. But no one has taken the time to put that together. And I always tell people that that's the same type of noise that you hear when you walk into a symphony hall and all the instruments are playing. But what happens is that when the conductor stands up there and he puts it together, that noise can be transformed into beautiful music. And that's what we're trying to do in the city of Philadelphia, is turn that music into noise. And then also, one of the important other factors is that we have to develop intermediary markers. One of the things that happens when you're a marathon runner and you're running a race is that you have markers along the way that lets you know that you're going to get to the finish line. We've not developed those intermediary markers in many of our communities. And so many community efforts are being undertaken, but people don't know whether they are, in fact, reducing the homicide rate. We have not developed those intermediary markers. And I believe that that's going to be the responsibility of many of our academic institutions to identify what those benchmarks should be so that communities will know that they're on the right track as it relates to alleviating this particular problem. We say that he who upsets a thing should know how to rearrange it. And in Philly, even though we are struggling every day, we're trying to alleviate this problem, as I said, and trying, most importantly, to place many prevention strategies on the table. We believe that it is our responsibility to use the combined strength of scientific knowledge, multidisciplinary skill, sustained commitment, cultural vitality, community support, and political will to enable persons, especially our young people, to achieve their potential via full and active lives. We're still struggling with this issue, as many other cities are, but we believe that we're beginning to make a headway, and I thank you all very much.
I want to thank Dr. Saunders.
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation, Dr. Brown, and glad to be here. It has been said that there are three types of people in the world: those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who don't know what hit them. Unfortunately, too many government agencies, including many police departments, fall into that latter group. We often don't know what hit us until it's too late. Traditionally, the police have been very good at reacting to crises, but we have not been very good at anticipating the future or planning for it in any kind of strategic manner. That's why the research and writings of people like Elliot Curry and John DeLulio and others have been so important to police executives across the country. In many ways, it is your ideas and predictions that have prompted police to take a new and critical look at such fundamental issues as the role of police in society and our most basic philosophies and strategies of policing. And perhaps most importantly, your research has helped to focus our attention on the future and on what we as police agencies can do to make the future safer and less fearful for our communities, even in light of some of the dire predictions we have heard here tonight. today. This latter point, the idea that police can and indeed must do something about the future, is critically important. Because I think the temptation for many people, including many tradition-bound police officers and executives, is to simply accept future predictions at face value and then hunker down for the impending crime wave. In the history presented by Dr. Curry, if it's any guide, the traditional response to the future would involve passing even tougher laws, hiring even more police and prosecutors, and building jails and prisons at a rate never seen before, except perhaps here in Texas. And in a way, who could really blame the traditionalist way of thinking? Consider some of the recent trends and future predictions. The stunning rise in juvenile crime since the mid-1980s, a time of fewer young people, but far more youth violence. 39 to 40 million children in our country under the age of 10 who will reach their crime-prone years over from 10 to 15 years. The number of teenagers in the United States growing by 20 to 30% over the next 15 years, a steady, almost relentless increase in this population cohort. And while we know that just a very small percentage of all juveniles are ever arrested for a violent crime, at current rates that could translate into as many as 260,000 juveniles arrested for violent crimes in the year 2010, twice the current number, according to the Justice Department. What makes these empirically based facts and projections all the more alarming is that they are constantly reinforced by sensational examples of almost unbelievable violence and brutality. In a way, it is becoming irrelevant what the statistics show or what the experts predict. It's what people see and hear when they turn on the news or pick up the morning paper that influences their thoughts and their behavior. And these days, what they see and what they hear is frightening. As Dr. Curry found in his local paper, every city in every state has its share of such cases. In Chicago, for example, we're still feeling the reverberations of Robert Yummy Sandifer 2 years after he made the cover of Time magazine. Yummy was an 11-year-old boy, a member of the Black Disciples gang, who shot and killed a 14-year-old girl in August 1994, only to be shot and killed himself, execution style, by members of his own gang 4 days later. The gang bosses had become fearful that Yummy would implicate them if police tracked him down before the gang did. So the gang leaders ordered two brothers, ages 14 and 16 at that time, to lure the 11-year-old killer out of hiding and take care of him first, which they did in a pedestrian tunnel on the city's south side. One of the brothers, now 16, was convicted as an adult earlier this month and is awaiting sentencing. His brother has just gone on trial. Now, for many people, cases like Yummy Sandifer serve to fortify their fatalistic views about the future of urban America. The perspective that demography is indeed destiny when it comes to urban crime and violence in the coming years. But cases such as these can do something else. They can help expose the complexity of the problems we face and maybe help point us in the right direction for addressing those problems in the future. That Yummy Sandifer was abused as a child, that he joined the Black Disciples at age 10 when the gang offered him the recognition and support that was sorely lacking elsewhere in his life, that he was able to obtain a gun so easily and use it so casually, that the root of this tragic cycle of violence was a deadly turf war over drugs, that the gang had such dominance over its members that two of them, not even old enough to drive a car, would go out and execute one of their own, an 11-year-old boy. These details certainly add to the overall sensationalism of the story and make the larger problem of urban crime and violence seem all the more overwhelming. But I would argue, as others have today, that those very same factors, family violence, community disintegration, street gangs, guns, and drugs, point to the underlying causes of urban crime and to the strategies we need to be developing to successfully impact this problem in the future. A lot of mainstream media coverage of people like John DeLulio and others seems to focus so much on the sensational aspects of their predictions that it misses the critical underlying message that we need to be firming up families and filling up schools and churches and community centers, not jails and prisons. But I can tell you that significantly this underlying message is beginning to resonate with more and more law enforcement executives. I have the privilege, along with several other police chiefs and prosecutors from across the country, of serving on the advisory board of an organization called Fight Crime, Invest in Kids. Earlier this year, this group commissioned a survey of the nation's police chiefs concerning crime and young people. Let me highlight a few of the findings. According to the survey, police chiefs agreed by a margin of 9-1 that America could sharply reduce crime if government invested more in programs to help young children get a good start. Programs such as Head Start, parental training, improved schools and after-school programs, and mentoring. 9 out of 10 chiefs also agreed that if America does not invest in programs to help children and youth now, we will pay far more for it later in crime, welfare, and other costs. And when asked to rank several policies in terms of their long-term effectiveness in reducing crime and violence, nearly 3 times as many chiefs found the best solution to be increasing investments in programs that help all children and youth get a good start than ranked trying more juveniles as adults or even hiring more police officers. Don't get me wrong, today's law enforcement leaders recognize the need for strong law enforcement and adequate correctional resources to truly remove dangerous offenders off the street. But we also recognize that it will take much more than traditional short-term criminal justice measures to deal with the very real challenges of the future, in part because many of these challenges are so deeply rooted in problems that have been festering for years. If we step back for a minute and look at the crime problems of today, especially problems related to gang violence and illegal drugs, we see that the genesis of many of our problems is not in the 1990s, but oftentimes in the 1960s. Today, 3 out of every 4 adults arrested in Chicago test positive for illegal drugs. But in many respects, today's drug-abusing offenders are the latest iteration of a drug culture that began 3 decades ago. Similarly, when John DeLulio and William Bennett, what they describe as the abject moral poverty of so many of today's young people, can be traced in part to the cycle of economic poverty and dependency of their parents and their parents' parents. From a public safety perspective, the problem was that during those years, when first adult crime and then juvenile crime were on the rise, the criminal justice response to the situation was largely one-dimensional. Under the so-called traditional model of policing, we gave our police officers very few tools or opportunities beyond arrest and incarceration to deal with the broad spectrum of crime problems they encounter on a daily basis. Not only the gangs, guns, and drugs, but other community conditions that often breed serious crime. Today, enlightened police executives have begun to recognize that we must become more strategic and multidimensional when it comes to fighting crime. We must blend the best elements of traditional crime control with a newly re-energized focus on true crime prevention. We must overcome the nothing works cynicism and do something more. And in many cities, including Chicago, that something more has become embodied in the emerging philosophy of community or problem-oriented policing. What I will call community policing has unfortunately become one of the most overused and least understood concepts of policing in the 1990s. Our moderator, Lee Brown, was experimenting with innovative community and problem-oriented policing strategies more than a decade ago. And since then, police agencies have become more sophisticated and more strategic in their application of community policing. Yet many people today continue to misinterpret the basic philosophy as either some nostalgic throwback to the days of Officer Friendly, or worse yet, a clever public relations ploy designed primarily to allay the public's substantial fear of crime. I'm here to tell you today that community policing is neither of the above. In fact, given the incredible challenges of the new century and seemingly insurmountable tasks that we face in trying to control crime and violence in our cities, I would argue that community policing is the most appropriate, most effective, and the most hopeful approach that the police have for the future. In Chicago, our community policing strategy is called CAPS, Chicago's Alternative Policing Strategy. and is giving our police officers the time and opportunity, as well as the training and technology, to form powerful new crime-fighting partnerships with the community, partnerships that are helping us to deal with the problems before they spin out of control. Let me mention a couple of concrete examples. In the Robert Taylor homes, in one of the most impoverished communities in the nation, our public housing section recently joined forces with local corporations, the Illinois Institute of Technology, and others to create a computerized family learning center. The center offers young people a safe alternative to gangs while allowing them to learn valuable skills for the future. In Little Village, a predominantly Latino neighborhood on the west side, our gang tactical officers are working with community outreach workers, the probation department, and university researchers to target known gang members with enforcement action when that is needed, but also with counseling and job education referrals. And in Englewood, another high-crime community on the south side, police officers and young people have come together in non-confrontational settings such as lock-ins, youth forums, to share ideas, viewpoints, and concerns. Other cities are adopting their own innovations. In Phoenix, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and other cities, police curfew enforcement programs now demand parental involvement and provide badly needed social services to both violators and their families. In Seattle, the Cops and Docs program pairs police officers and medical professionals who talk with young people matter-of-factly about the consequences of violence and the options and choices that they hold. And in Boston, innovative approaches to tracing and interrupting the flow of firearms have significantly reduced the number of drive-by and other shootings. These and countless other examples of effective policing across the country share the same common elements: partnerships with other agencies and a focus on long-range problem solving. One lesson law enforcement has learned over the last 3 decades is that we cannot solve the problems of crime and violence on our own, but we can be a leader, a catalyst for change. Community policing allows the police to meld the traditional law enforcement role with this new and more activist role of convener, facilitator, and community problem solver. The police cannot build and operate the community health facility or the drug treatment center or the recreational facility. That is not what community policing is about. But we can help provide for the safe and secure environment in which these type of facilities can flourish. And then we can work with agencies to see that people who could benefit from their resources are directed to them. There will always be outbursts of crime and violence and neighborhood disorder in our cities, and the community will always turn to the police to quell them. But it's only through broad-based partnerships, the types of partnerships envisioned by true community policing, that we will begin to address some of those underlying causes and conditions that lead to those outbursts in the first place. This focus on underlying causes and conditions and on longer-range problem-solving holds the real promise of community policing. Let me offer one final perspective on today's topic. We've been focusing mostly on urban crime and violence, but I think the evidence suggests that in the next century, we could be dealing with similar problems in our suburban and rural areas as well. It is certainly true that the precipitous rise in teenage crime that began in the mid-1980s was largely concentrated in poor minority urban areas ravaged by the host of problems that we've been discussing today: gangs, guns, drugs, child abuse, both moral and economic poverty. But as the inner cities have been abandoned and lost resources, many of the precursor problems, like gangs and drugs, have begun to spread to suburban and rural areas as well. We need to understand and better prepare for the market forces that are at work here. Markets, whether licit or illicit, will naturally and inevitably seek out new and even more profitable customer bases. Over the years, we have witnessed the illegal drug market spread like a cancer from its traditional base in the inner cities, first to the inner ring of suburbs, and now to the exurban and rural areas as well. And the problems of crime and violence have begun to follow those market shifts. In the last few years, many policing professionals have called on the justice system to treat crime and violence as a public health as well as a public safety problem. I think this perspective is appropriate as we begin to see this cancer of drugs and crime and violence spread from our cities to suburban and rural areas as well. I think the public health model to crime prevention is very compatible with and complementary to our models of community policing, and I hope we will see even greater collaboration among health and safety organizations in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Superintendent Rodriguez, for your outstanding presentation. And our next presenter will be Chief Charles Moose from Portland, Oregon.
Good morning. Well, I know we've been sitting and you've been quiet for a little while, but can we do a little bit? Good morning. Good morning. Maybe you should clear that air out of your lungs and readjust yourself in your seat. We've got a few more presentations, but we do need you to be awake and active. Let's also take a few moments to remember why we're here. We're here talking about possible solutions to domestic problems. And I think that's very key. When I grew up as a young person in this country, the domestic problem that I worried about, that my parents worried about, we worried about being attacked by the Russians. That we went through exercise after exercise at elementary school as to where to go, how to get under cover in case there was an attack. At home, we talked about shelters, we talked about places to go in an inevitable attack from the Russians, that we were all going to go and be safe and survive that very tragic incident. Well, today, when I go to the elementary schools as a police officer, the young people very proudly show me that they know what to do in case there's an attack in the principal's office or in the parking lot on the playground. They know where to go if the gangsters show up and start shooting. They know how to get under their desks and get against a wall where there's no window for cover. When I go out in the community, my neighbors tell me that some of them still put their kids in the bathtub at night because they think that is the safe place to be against attacks, domestic attacks from our neighbors. So when we talk about why we're here, I think we have some serious problems, and we need to really start moving the envelope in terms of confronting the crime problem. In my mind, the most serious domestic problem facing us today. Because I thought that once it became obvious that the Russians weren't near as powerful as they had been made out to be, I thought we were really okay. When I saw the Berlin Wall go down, for some reason, that was very comforting. But again, as I travel in my city, I don't see that comfort. And when I talk to the young people in the elementary schools, I don't see that comfort. So let's talk about some things that on my mind in terms of how do you actually address this domestic problem, things that you can really do. Number one, I think we heard a bit of it from Superintendent Rodriguez, but I think we need to be much more direct, that we need to change policing in this nation. And in addition to that, we need to also change our criminal justice system. And number two, we've also heard pieces of that we need a holistic approach to human and community development. But let me focus first on changing policing. Community policing. Community policing is a new philosophy of policing that is based on the concept that the police and the community working together will seek innovative solutions to contemporary community issues in the areas of crime, fear of crime, social disorder, and neighborhood decay. It means the police get to do more than just be involved in crime, but we really have a role and a partnership with regards to fear of crime, social disorder, and neighborhood decay. Just arresting people is not good enough. And as we go about changing policing in this country, we must have police agencies that focus on values, because we must have that focus on values if we want to renew and regain that very valuable public trust that I'm afraid we've lost over the years because of the behavior of police officers in our various communities. That without that public trust, we will never be able to have a community that participates in its own public safety, because they don't trust the people that are there that are sworn to protect them. They see them as the enemy, and they see them in a light of fear, because we don't have a value-based organization. In the Portland Police Bureau, we have become a value-driven organization. We've had a great deal of success stressing the values of partnership, empowerment, problem-solving, accountability, and lastly, service. A simple recognition that it is a profession of service and not a profession of excitement. But when you talk about changing policing, let me focus on some key elements to changing policing and the components of the broken criminal justice system. One, we need to focus more on crime prevention and problem solving. We cannot allow things to simply become a crime of opportunity. When you talk about prevention, we're talking about giving people the education, the information, and the instruments that they need in order to protect themselves from crimes of opportunity. The reality that at some point we really do need to lock our homes, to lock our cars, to put lights in areas where they're dark, to do the simple things that we think we all know, but when you go around the various communities in our country, those things are still not occurring. When police officers go to take reports, to spend time with victims, they find that those victims have not prepared themselves to try to prevent becoming a victim. And then certainly, problem solving. We cannot allow a situation to become a repeat call for service. When we go to a situation and the police officer says to the supervisor, and the supervisor says to the chief, we've been here before, we go there every Friday night, this is not the first time we've done this, then we really need to be about the business of asking the question, if we've been here before, if we've seen it before, then why don't we think about what is the root cause that caused us to be here, and let's solve that. But problem solving, not keeping the data, not writing the report, but actually preventing and solving the problem so that we don't have to return to that situation again. Secondly, key element, system repair. In my mind, I think there's been a great deal of focus on the police. There's been the whole era of professionalism. We certainly have seen the influx of money from the administration with regards to the cops, the community order and policing grants, the National Institute of Justice spending thousands and thousands of dollars putting out research, trying to give information to police officers and police executives and communities about what works in policing. There have been movement for standards, accreditation, a whole area where a lot of focus on the front-end loaders of the criminal justice system. Let's make the police better. But at the same hand, where has the focus been with regards to the prosecutors? Have the courts improved? What do we do about training judges to come up with solutions to solve problems? What do we do? What occurs in the jails? Why do we recognize the fact that in the city of Portland 2 weeks ago, we took a prisoner to the sheriff to put in jail on Tuesday. On Friday, they were panically calling us, wanting to know more information about who put this person in jail. We want to interview the officer. We said, well, why do you want to interview the officer? You're not the prosecutor. You're simply the jailer. only to find out what actually had happened is that on Friday, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the prisoner died of a drug overdose. If we have a jail and we have drugs in the jail, then why don't we focus on trying to control that environment? We have them in that structured environment and they still have drugs. So we don't spend any energy or any time in that very isolated arena. What kind of research, what kind of details available, what works in community corrections? Have we spent any time? Do we know the numbers, the thousands of people that are on parole and probation in our communities today? What kind of help are we giving in the area of community corrections? What occurs within these institutions has a huge impact on whether police clients listen to reason, feel that there is any hope, or think that they have a chance outside the life of crime. If you put people in jail, you put them in prison, and while they're in prison, they use drugs, and while they're in prison, they're raped, while they're in prison, they're abused by the system, and then they come home to the community, and I tell my police officers to treat them with respect, to talk to them, to try to help them find work, to try to reason with them, and then I wonder why these people and the police officers don't get along. But when they've been in that kind of condition, when the system has been that insensitive to them, then why is it they should expect the police to be sensitive to them? So if we don't take the holistic approach, the people coming out of jail will already be convinced that their only hope in the world is to be further involved in crime. And we certainly must think about problem solving within the rest of the criminal justice system also. I've been reading with great interest the one case involving the former Congressman Melvin Reynolds in the Illinois area. He's in jail now because of some violations and some things that he did when he was there representing his constituency. He's lost everything that he had in life, and he actually is in jail as a convicted felon. But now, apparently, there are 16 other felony charges being brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not only that, but we're now going to bring charges against his wife so that she can't be available to raise the 2 kids. Not that she's really got a chance, because she's also lost everything in this whole process. Now, I'm not denying that he made some mistakes and that he is wrong. But at some point, I have to ask, is the problem solved, or do we need to expend more resources to make sure that this person stays in jail for the rest of their life, to make sure that his wife goes to jail for the rest of her life, and to make sure that the children do not have a parent whatsoever to be at home with them? I don't know. But I do know that if we don't look at solving the problem and stop focusing on how much can we punish those individuals that we do catch, then perhaps we are mistaken about solving the crime problem. Thirdly, we need to talk about power sharing if we're going to change policing. Externally, community members, communities of interest must serve as advisors, volunteers, participants with responsibility and authority. People must feel a part of their own public safety. It is not something to be done solely by the police, for the police, without the public. And certainly internally, there must be a change in management style. Again, the police bureau, specifically in the Portland Police Bureau, does not belong to me. It belongs to all of the people that work there, the police officers, the clerks, the secretaries, the janitors. More voices must be heard. Empowerment must be real. If we really want people to go and be innovative, to think of solutions, to participate in the lives of those that are less fortunate, we must have a management style that starts by letting them be a part of the solution. Fourthly, we must change policing by bringing into the police profession caring police officers. A strange term, but somehow police officers need to have a bit of soul, a bit of feeling for the job, and they must have compassion for the people who are in need. When we talk about community policing, there's several terms that we throw out there. We talk about foot patrol, bicycle patrol, decentralization, all kind of words that may or may not mean anything to you. But what we're really trying to do is we're trying to put the police officers in an environment that fosters ownership and caring. That when we take them all out of the big headquarters building and put them in the smaller areas and tell them that this neighborhood, these streets belong to you, that you need to walk them, you need to work them, and you need to find out what the people in this area want you to do, what we're talking about is trying to get a way for the police officers to care and be concerned about the people that they're serving. We've become too isolated. So don't let the terms decentralization, some kind of new deployment strategy, or bike patrol, or foot patrol, or a community contact office, don't let those terms sway you. What we're really talking about is putting policemen in an environment where they can learn to care about the people like you that live in certain neighborhoods. We need to also give them time to interact, to get to know, to listen, and to talk to people in a non-hostile environment. Too many of our police contacts in the country today are based on us intervening at a time of crisis. That community policing is really about finding a way to put police officers in the community when the community is not at crisis. Secondly, I'd like to focus some key elements on a holistic approach to human and community development. We've heard some comments this morning: government, business, neighborhood partnerships. The reality that we don't get our arm around the crime problem if we ignore education. There are many great thinkers in our history. Mark Twain: every time you stop a school, you will have to build a jail. So this is not new stuff. This is not rocket scientists. We've known a lot of this information for a long time. In Oregon, we are preparing to spend more money on prisons in 1997 through 99 budget than we're going to spend on higher education. We've already committed to doing it. Oregon spending on youth and adult prisons has already increased by 53% since the 1991-93 budget period, while spending on public schools rose 12%. As a matter of fact, spending on higher education dropped by 14% since 1991 and 1992. So we know the facts, we have the information, but we're proceeding to make the error. How much further will we go before we start to listen? We need to know and understand healthcare, drug treatment. Oregon healthcare is often taken to Washington, D.C. as a model, but we still have federal regulations that remain problematic. There are things we can't do that we realize we need to do as a community, but for some reason, our leaders in Washington tell us that we cannot do them. How much further will we go before we learn? We've certainly heard some things this morning about jobs. It certainly continues to be a fact that those involved in street drug sales don't really get rich. But when I talk to them, they tell me that at least they've got a job. They consider selling drugs on the street their job. because some reason our system either doesn't provide a job, and certainly on those occasions when it does, they're not welcome at that job. Again, not new information, not new facts, but we refuse to take on some of the more difficult tasks. And I really won't spend time talking about the whole housing issue, because again, the same answers, the same problems, not willing to take on those difficult tasks, to do what we know the data tells us to do, that we must build healthy communities. The recognition is it's all interrelated. Not any one piece gets to stand alone. We don't get to do police and not do education. We don't get to do jobs and not do housing. But I guess my message is, I feel like we really do know the answers, but we're not willing to stand up and make the tough decisions. And I start by saying, again, the police are aware of what the research says. The police are aware of the need to change, but we also don't make the tough decisions. We talk about community policing. We have various components of it. We have some cities that are doing it extremely well. But we still seem to think that the reason we have crime is because we have bad people in our communities. I think we have bad policies that cause some of our people to behave badly. I think the data's there. I think you have a lot of that information. I encourage you that if you don't have active community policing, then you need to go home and ask why not. You need to push, you need to insist. It doesn't need to come from Washington. It needs to come from community members like you. It needs to come from the bottom up, saying, why don't I know my police? Why don't the police work with me? Why don't the police work in this community? Why don't the police listen to the communities of interest and change their policies and their procedures that negatively impact those communities? We have a lot of the answers if we're willing to do the tough things. I think that this certainly is a group that will continue to send that message, but I'd like to reaffirm that crime is a domestic problem. People in our country are scared as I used to be of the Russians.
Thank you, Chief Moose, for your outstanding presentation. Our next and final panelist will be our District Attorney, Johnny Holmes.
Thank you. I feel like I was just brought up from the minor leagues after listening to this stuff. Reminds me of some of my University of Texas classes, hearing about Dr. Curry's view. I think perhaps I am the other side of his nightmare with respect to where criminal justice is going. Not to be outdone by a guy who's been in drugs for 10 years. I got a little story of my own. Back in 1974, then District Attorney Carol Vance appointed me as head of the Organized Crime Division of the District Attorney's Special Crimes Bureau, and because my sister lived in Austin at the time, and because we had some mutual acquaintances, both having attended and graduated from the University of Texas there, she happened to run into some of those folks at a cocktail party, and they asked my sister, well, how old Johnny was doing and what was he up to? And her response was, he's doing great, you know, he's in organized crime now. Also don't want to be outdone too badly by Dr. Curry with respect to whether or not the building of prisons is an important function of government in a free society. And I suppose that were we not a free society, it wouldn't be all that terribly important an endeavor. I suspect that Russia under the KGB and Germany under the auspices of the SS had very little difficulty in dealing with non-rule followers. And where I come from philosophically and from my individual perspective is based, like many psychologists say, where you were when and where you came from. And what I'm about to tell you about my philosophy is just mine. It's not necessarily right, it's just mine. And I was asked to be here, and so you're going to have to listen to it. But understand that it doesn't, because it's mine, doesn't mean that it's the correct approach. It's just one of the approaches, and I want to tell you how it was that I came to the philosophy that I have with respect to order in a free society. When I was growing up, I had the good fortune of being reared by some strong disciplinarian parents. They were big believers in rules and rule following and respect for the traditional mores of society. It was yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, no, sir, no, ma'am, and all the accoutrements that went with being a young person growing up in a disciplined and ordered family. Daddy had rules. We were certainly not allowed to participate in what those rules were to any degree or fashion. Something that we enjoy in a free society. If there is a certain rule or standard of conduct that no longer fits what we believe we should be doing in a current modern society, we can change those rules. And we've seen examples of those day in and day out. Attitudinal differences and approaches to rules that we have in this free society. So we have the right to participate in what those rules are. And that's good and that's healthy. But that wasn't the environment at home. The rules were established unilaterally, authoritarianly, and with very little concern about what the benefactors of those rules had to say about it. Violations of rules were swift and sure. I can remember no occasion where probation was even thought about. Daddy was a large man, and from time to time, certain transgressions called upon a sterner punishment than mere deprivation of privileges. It took Daddy 2 pulls to get his belt out from his waistband because of his size. And although he was not a mean person, he was a disciplinarian, and he wanted to ensure that his 4 children were raised in accordance with the standards that he thought were appropriate. And to that end, from time to time, we transgressed. And when we did, the punishment was a learning experience, something that I came to respect much more deeply as I matured than I did at the time. And that same type of approach really continued on into my educational experience. When I left the home, began kindergarten, went through HISD, it was a different approach to disciplinarian and attendance, what was expected of you. Teachers weren't afraid of the students. You didn't sass a teacher. Bring a pistol to school while we were in deep trouble if we brought chewing gum to the classroom. You remember the cinnamon toothpicks? I was sent to the coach, who at that time was the person that we now regard probably in our society as the jury system, in the form of one individual, and administered the sanction. And the sanction was always fairly representative of what the seriousness of the rule was regarded by the administration right there in that school. We didn't have any probation or any slack cut us with regards to what was expected. And that too was a learning experience in that it helped shape my attitude towards what was expected in the school environment. That continued right on through to my secondary work. I had the good fortune to play football at the University of Texas under Darrell Royal, and Royal, believe it or not, particularly you Aggies who may be in the crowd may find this very difficult to believe, but Coach Royal was one that believed very sincerely that your obligation at the University of Texas was first to obtain an education. That was the primary reason you were there. Why the university was spending good money to see to it that you stayed there was not so that you achieved all Southwest Conference or brought great esteem to the college scholastic program, yes, but certainly you weren't expected just to be a sports figure on behalf of the university. We had some outstanding students. We had who were athletes. We had some that were fairly mediocre and some that barely passed muster. But he believed sincerely that one of the things you could do at the university was attend class. Something I thought at the time was a fairly outrageous position, but nevertheless he insisted upon it, that if you weren't a rocket scientist, as has been talked about here, and your academic achievements were not that outstanding, at least you could do is go expose yourself to the material. And so failure to go to class was a sanctionable offense. The rules that Coach Royal had was simply, thou shalt not fail to attend class. And to that end, you were required to fill out a cut report. Monday morning, you would report to Lan Hewlett, one of the coaches, former dean of men from a West Texas high school, who was hired by Royal in a coaching spot to take care of the academic requirements of the athletes. And Coach Hewlett was an academic coach, and he was in charge of the cut reports. You had to sign that you had not missed any class the preceding week except as follows. And the except as follows better be some real good reason. A death in the family was acceptable. 2 broken legs was okay, they would look at one. He insisted that you go to class. As a freshman student, being exposed for the first time of a class of 547 chemistry students in freshman chemistry that started after the noon hour on a particular Thursday that I had something much better I thought I could be doing, I transgressed. I did not attend chemistry class that afternoon. And the following Monday, knowing that we were talking about spot checking literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of scholarship athletes, all the way from football players to golf and band. And those of you that were band scholarship holders, this football player holds no animosity towards a band member. They were great supporters of the school. But nevertheless, you're talking about a large amount of scholarships. There was no way I was going to get caught. Not so, I was caught. And the consequences of being caught violating that rule was something that gave me a significant attitude adjustment towards my academic career and is probably unilaterally responsible for my college degree, because the punishment was swift, it was sure, it was unpleasant as heck, and something that changed my approach to attendance. We had a trainer there, full-blooded Indian, some say a masochist, who called the transgressors at 5 a.m. and asked them to report to Memorial Stadium at the base of the stadium there on the track. And before reporting out to the track, you were to step by those great big lockers down there in the inside circle. Those big old doors on the wall, those are lockers full of all kind of stuff, among which are tackling dummies. And those things weigh 85 pounds if they haven't been there longer than about 5 or 10 years, which has meant they're heavier because of the moisture absorption. And so the first ones there got to pick out the newer tackling dummies that weighed closer to the manufacturer's weight. And you reported to the track, and on the whistle for 2 hours for that week, you ran from the track to the very tippy-top most of Memorial Stadium on the whistle, with the the trainer down on the track with a great big spotlight to be sure no one was hiding behind one of the seats. It was a full 6 weeks before I could walk down the stairs at Wagoner Hall without holding both hands on the handrail. It was something that I lived with every waking basis for a significant period of time at the University of Texas. And it caused me to adjust my discipline and to attend class with a much higher degree of regularity than I ever thought I would be able to. In society, we do the same things with respect to our rules. Every rule that is important and means something to us has some consequence for not following it. And failure to have consequences sends the wrong message. If it's a bad rule, repeal it. Get rid of it. Change it. If it's a rule that's worthy of having, enforce it. And that means when someone transgresses, really unpleasant things happen to that person, to the end that that person will serve as a lesson to others. Good example of that. Why is it, do you suppose, that every spring of the year, along in about February and March, the United States of America cranks up some giant tax evasion criminal case? Because on April 15th, they expect you all to voluntarily pay your taxes. And this is an example of what may happen to you in the event you decide that is not a worthwhile endeavor. It's an important rule to the United States and to our democracy that you pay your taxes. And so that serves as a lesson to others who may not be so inclined to do what's right, that failure to do what's right may well cause some unpleasant consequences. Now, as Dr. Curry suggests, it doesn't have to be prison. We find, however, that our most important rules, the ones that we regard more significant, there are more severe consequences. That was certainly true when I was growing up. Daddy had the thought, I think probably valid, nothing good ever happens after midnight. And you better be home by 11 p.m. or you're in deep trouble. And he meant it. And it was embarrassing to be somewhere with your friends, your peer group, and say, well, I'm going to have to mosey on and I got something such to do. Did I have enough guts to admit that I had to be home at 11 o'clock or else what for was to pay? Because there was. But it made me follow the rules. And so our important rules have really severe consequences for their violation. Death penalty, for example. You walk in a place with a pistol, and I don't care whether you're underprivileged, minority, I don't care what your background is, I don't care who you are. But when you walk in there armed with a deadly weapon and you stick it in somebody's face and you demand their property or money, and just for the fun of it, you blow them away, we say that's a pretty significant transaction. And we want to have significant consequences. The reason the prisons have gotten so expensive in the last 2 decades is because we have been told how they should be managed and maintained. Kind of reminds me of the young man who was being prosecuted for killing his parents. And during the course of the trial and after the judgment of guilty, he asked the judge to please consider leniency since he was now an orphan. It is something, I think, that is self-inflicted, the fact that it's costing us so much today to inflict consequences, and indeed severe consequences, on folks who violate our most sacred rules. The rules are ours. We get to make them. We get to discard those that are no longer effective. And one of the functions that you have, I think, and all of us have, in participating in sessions like this, is to formulate some ideas, some philosophies of your own. What are our goals, and where are we going, and how shall we accomplish those goals? It is my upbringing, my 28 years of prosecuting, And I disagree with those that suggest the numbers don't show effective use of our penal system. Now, my numbers are just here in Harris County. I'm not talking about California or Oregon or any place. I'm talking about Harris County, Texas. When the prison system started taking our 6,000 inmates in our jail that belonged in prison and not in jail, when we increased the ability for the prison system to do that by taking those state-ready felons, coincidentally, if you will, crime dropped in this municipality, in this county, and it's still down. Is that cause and effect? I don't know. But common sense tells me that those things I learned as a young child and continued to learn as a student in public schools, and what I continued to learn at the University of Texas, that experience has suggested to me that when you violate the rules, unpleasant things should happen to you. And that's where I come from, and that's what I bring to you. Thank you.
We certainly want to express our thanks to our District Attorney, Jenny Holmes, for his outstanding presentation. Now, this is the part of our program where the audience can participate. We will now go into our question and answer session. If any other of you who have questions who have not submitted them, there are cards and our ushers will pick them up. The first question is addressed to our police chiefs. And the question reads, what can corporate America do to assist with reducing urban crime and violence besides throwing money at the problem?
You know, when we talk about partnerships, when we talk about partnerships and developing partnerships with the community, we're talking about the private sector also. And I think that it's important for the private sector to recognize that they have an interest, certainly an investment in a particular community in which their office or which their factory is located. But the private sector can be open to exchange of information with the police department, becoming part of this partnership that I'm talking about, recognizing that they are part of a community.
Yes, I think, and it was private sector?
Corporate America.
Corporate America. I think there's, two critical points for me. One is that we did talk about changing management style within policing, within our public government entities. That, it's often said, but we really do need that insight, that perspective. How do you change the paradigm? How do you actually become customer oriented? We like to think that, well, no matter what, you're going to continue to pay for police. But at some point, we really have to take on some kind of profit mentality. That if you don't continue to do a good job as policing, what I'll find in my community is that there'll be more private security companies. That if we don't do a good job managing prisons, then private corporations will start to manage those prisons. So we need that mentality, that change in that management approach, that kind of training, that perspective and insight that the private sector brings to the job. And I think certainly that second piece is we need the private sector to stay in our communities, to not flee to our suburbs. There's been so much flight from some of our inner city neighborhoods where I talk to older community members and they tell me how on this street 50 years ago, there used to be all of these businesses. There used to be jobs within walking distance. There used to be all of these major J.C. Penney's and all these corporations that now are in the suburbs or in the malls of Portland. You've got to get in a car and you've got to drive to them. And what I've got left is empty, vacant buildings on the inner city. So I guess in some way, we need those corporations to stay. We need them to reinvest in the inner city, to be there, to keep that community viable and keep it up and functioning.
Thank you. Although a question may be addressed to any specific member of the panel, all of you may participate as you so see fit. The next one goes to District Attorney Holmes, and the question is the policy of 3 strikes, you're out, a good and effective policy?
Depends on your perspective. If you're asking me if I think it is, the answer is yes. Texas first had that policy in 1857. How about that? Remember Clinton talking about what a great deal that was, 3 strikes and you're out, and I think some other states signed up with that. Texas has the so-called habitual criminal statute, first became law in 1857. It stayed with us until 1982. Over a century, we had that law. I think it's good. It's no longer part of it because we thought we should cut slack with the worst offenders in order to prevent the prisons from filling up. And so the ones we cut slack on are the folks who show the least amount of inclination towards rehabilitation. I am the messenger, not the author of that change.
If there are other viewpoints, we'll be glad to hear them.
I'm just fearful that when we continue to dictate to our various professionals within the system that circumstances are somehow, if you get the wrong person in a 3-strike scenario, then you've done an injustice there. And so if we tie the hands of our judges, then why do we need judges? I guess that at some point we have to trust them to look at all of the circumstances and make decisions that are there best to solve the problem for all of us. That if we as voters simply put in all of the mandates and the rules and regulations, and so then we just have a person that looks at all of the laws and the regulations that we voted in, and if you fit into that puzzle, if then the judge has no option except to give you this amount of time, then maybe we could save the money and not have judges. We could just have the computer say, look at the record and spit out what the voters have put there. So
Judges
somehow,
don't do it in Texas. Juries do habitual criminal prosecutions in Texas, and they do so with some degree of enthusiasm. And the jury is always right.
But I'm afraid that when you look at the basic 3 strikes in some places, what you get is a very simple formula that neither the jury nor the judges have any impact.
No question. I don't think anybody would want to put an innocent person in jail for life. We're assuming that we're talking about a person who has committed a felony, been caught, successfully prosecuted and not given probation or suspended sentence or some type of community-based non-confinement sanction, but is sent to prison, serves his time, is released, is caught committing another felony, goes back to prison, no conditional release but confinement, is released, and thereafter commits that 3rd felony. Texas law from 1857 to 1982 said there was no discretion in the jury or the judge. You're going to do a so-called life automatically. A so-called life, up until recently, was 1/4 of your sentence or 15 years, whichever's less. So this 3-time ex-con is going to have to do 15 years. Big deal.
Go ahead, Dr. Perry.
If I could just jump in here a little bit. I think, 3 strikes is very interesting to us in California because we have recently, a couple of years ago, passed what is the nation's sort of most severe 3 strikes and you're out law. And I think when you want to try to assess whether these things are good or effective or not, you have to focus on who exactly they're targeted at. What kind of offender are we talking about? Most states that have passed these laws in the last couple of years have targeted them specifically on repeat violent offenders. Now, what's happened, interestingly enough, is the states that have done that haven't put many people behind bars under these 3 strikes laws. And why not? Because they were already behind bars. The fact is those people already go behind bars in most states, and increasingly so in recent years, for a long time. Now, what we do in California, which is another different story, is we can put fairly unserious offenders behind bars for 25 years to life under our new law. And it's going to be at least 20 years or 25 that they serve, unlike the statute that Mr. Holmes was talking about here. Now, the question then we have to ask ourselves is, suppose you do have a repeat property offender who just can't seem to get his act straight one way or another. Maybe he's got a drug problem. Maybe he's got an alcohol problem. He keeps offending. We catch him that third time, and we say, you're going to prison for 25 years to life. If he's a reasonably old offender, he will probably die in prison. I think we do have to ask, is that the kind of choice we want to make? If so, why? Are there other things we might do with those offenders?
Our next question is directed to Dr. Saunders, and it reads, one cost of crime is AIDS infection by IV drug users. Does Philadelphia have a needle exchange program or other addict initiatives?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the health commissioner that brought me on board in 1992 was very supportive of a needle exchange program. We do have one in the city of Philadelphia. What was it? What?
Does Philadelphia have a needle exchange or other addict initiatives?
We also are, the other addict initiatives we have a drug partnership program where community-based organizations have input into what they believe will be some of the solutions as it relates to drug addiction and what needs to be done. Of course, there's a lot more that needs to be done. I argue that probably substance abuse is going to be one of the biggest public health issues we're going to face next. I don't believe that the criminal justice system is the only system that needs to deal with this issue. I think that it's going to take a multidisciplinary approach also to deal with this particular problem.
Thank you. And a related question is, this is addressed to all panelists, what will be the effect on overall crime if we were to legalize drugs?
Where do we begin there, Lee? Do we say we'll make drugs legal for 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds? These people, in fact, are getting drugs in the illicit market. Where should we begin? Should we begin at your house or your community school, your neighborhood? I think the willingness of individuals to even consider legalizing drugs, I don't think there's enough thought given to it. You know, we police are fortunate that 90-some% of the people in this country obey the law. There are probably a great number of people who would experiment with drugs if they were legal. Have you got any idea what will happen to the health of this country if, in fact, legalization comes? I think that just to get rid of the market, which is it's laudable, that's great if we could do that, but it's not going to go away. You're not going to allow legalization for drugs for youths, young people. They will be in the illicit market. You won't get rid of the market. I just think it's ill-conceived. It's a problem, a very complex problem, but we can't just give up for the sake of the country.
I certainly concur with Superintendent Rodriguez, but also encourage us to think about the fact that we like to think that maybe a lot of people are involved in crime because they're trying to get money to purchase drugs, and therefore let's argue about legalization. I think we forget about the number of people that are involved in crime because they are on drugs and they're in an altered state of mind. They, one, don't understand the consequences. They forget the fact that there are consequences to their behavior. And then secondly, they're not behaving in a rational state because they're not rational. And so therefore, they don't understand what they're doing. They're making decisions, they're acting, they're responding. We also need to consider, when you think about that in reality, alcohol is a drug. The number of people that get involved in crime, the number of people that abuse other people when they're in a state of alcoholic abuse, those people are all involved in crime. So let's just triple, quadruple let's just run those numbers up as high as you want to go. And I think what you get is you get a great deal more crime because people won't know what they're doing. They'll be acting in this altered state of mind.
I also concur with the previous two speakers. I think that it's a simplistic solution. Most people don't understand that the risk factors for interpersonal violence is that many of these people know each other, that in some form or fashion even look like each other, may love each other. And if you think of violence in a simplistic model of explosive anger in the face of impulsivity, where we now have advanced technology and people use other means of killing each other, you understand that alcohol and drugs can potentiate your explosive anger, it can potentiate your impulsivity. So to think that it's the only solution is to one of the obstacles I said about the simplistic approach to this. It's a very complex problem, and therefore simple solutions may help, but it will not exactly alleviate the problem by itself.
Yeah. Dr. Curry?
Yeah, I would agree, and it makes me feel very safe somehow to agree with police chiefs. I don't know why that is, but it's a nice feeling. But I too think if by legalization of drugs, what we mean is deregulating the drug market and let everybody buy and sell all the drugs we want, just like cigarettes, only more so, I think we'd be in for a terrible problem. I do think, however, that we could approach the way we deal with drug offenders somewhat differently than we do in the criminal justice system. This is not legalization, but it does amount to investing more money and attention into diverting some of those offenders from the justice system into treatment outside the system. I think in particular that the experiments with drug courts that are going on now in many places across the country are very promising in that respect. In a drug court, you come in and the judge puts you into a treatment program, and you will go to the slammer. There will, as Mr. Holmes says, there will indeed be a consequence if you don't do your treatment program. But if you do, then the charges against you will be dropped, and hopefully you will have your drug problem taken care of, rather than simply recycling through that system over and over again with your problem unaddressed. We have, it's estimated sometimes that we have about 60% of our state prison inmates in California have a drug problem. Less than 4% are in any kind of drug treatment while they're in prison. That's a recipe for disaster.
This question is directed to Dr. Curry. It reads, given the support for early intervention with kids, should parental rights be terminated if babies are born drug addicted? If not, what is the second chance?
Whoa. It's a very tough question. It's actually the kind of question that I have grappled with a lot. I'm not sure that I really know the answer to that. Off the top of my head, I would say no. I think that we have ways of working with most families, not all families, but even families that produce a drug-addicted child, even families that engage in fairly serious instances of abuse or neglect. We may be able to work with those families, keep those families together, and avoid out-of-home placement for the kid, which is not necessarily such a great alternative. That's not going to happen in all circumstances. There are situations where kids are treated so badly and where the family situation is so dysfunctional or non-existent that we're going to have to remove that child. And I do think that ought to be something of a last resort.
This one is for the police officials, and it asks, will increasing the number of police officers per se reduce violent crime?
I've never seen proof of that. I've heard the subject brought up quite often. What's happened with the Cops More program now, we have in the city of Chicago, we've hired 1,000 new police officers over the last 3 years. 500 of those officers came through the Cops Ahead program. I think you have to look back at some circumstances that have gone on in this country over the past few decades. One is the unionization of police has increased. And what I have found in my department, we had a 1.6 replacement factor. That was the amount of police officers it takes to assign a single beat or location on a 7-day a week, 24-hour-a-day basis. With unionization, and increasingly the politicians find it easier to give benefits like days off and vacations than it is to give money. So over the years, these things stacked up, and the replacement factor in the Chicago Police Department is now 2. So we can have situations where 30 years ago, if you had 9,000 officers to do X functions, today you'd probably need an additional 2,000 officers to perform those same functions. And I think that what we're seeing now is some catch-up, particularly with the assignment of officers. I know you and Mayor Dinkins were able to convince the New York legislature that New York City needed a lot more police. But I think we need to take a look at how we use police. That's the most important thing, how we assign them and the kind of information we provide them with technologically and to make them more effective.
Thank you. Now, this was for the district attorney. Have creative sentencing
Well,
programs.
can I run roughshod over his question?
Go right ahead.
I got an opinion on that. I disagree with him. I think police visibility can and will reduce crimes of opportunity. Now, what do you mean violent crimes? When the brother-in-law opens the wrong can of beer and he gets mad and shoots the other relative, police visibility is not going to stop that kind of homicide. And that is the majority of homicides in this jurisdiction. They occur between people who know each other. Police visibility is not going to stop that. But it's going to stop the kinds of things that are aggravating the way out of us as a society. Burglary, carjackings, robberies. These crimes of opportunity are not going to be committed when you see a uniform visibility of the sovereign near at hand. The perfect example of that is driving down the Katy Freeway. You'll get run over in the mornings if you're not doing about 70, unless there is significant police visibility, in which event it takes you much longer to get to town.
But I think the I guess I appreciate that, but I'd still contend that we arrest by far more than our fair share. But somehow I'm convinced that we, the police, have broken the rest of the system. So if you pour money into the front end and don't create a whole system, then you're not going to get any reduction in crime, because you're going to get that revolving door, and the prosecutors and the jailers and the prisoners, prison wardens won't be able to keep them all. We'll be able to load them up much, much faster than anybody else in the system. And I think we've been on that course for a number of years, and at least in my jurisdiction, we've broken the rest of that system because people have given us more police, and we arrest and arrest and arrest, and it's the same people in and out because the rest of the system can't handle it.
We fill the courtrooms and fill the jails, and if you build more prisons, we'll fill them as fast as you build them. That's not the problem. The problem is, in fact, the complex issues that contribute to crime. And I still say effective use of police, which is the visibility you talk about, Counsel, I think that's what I'm talking about. I never said that you shouldn't have more police. However, the number of police that are available to a force may not have, there's a point of diminishing returns in terms of how many more police officers do you add and how much crime can you expect to reduce. So I don't think that has ever been proven.
Well, Houston's a damn good model. Might take a look.
You got a good police department.
We had an increase in staff and a reduction in crime.
Well, that leads to the next question for the district attorney. And that is, have creative sentencing programs used by some judges worked to reduce repeat offenders?
No. Creative sentencing is good. It's really neat. Like when Judge Poe, required the guy to clean up the stables when he stole the Lone Ranger's pistols. Remember that? He tells it at every speech. Everybody here has heard him talk about that. That's creative sentencing. But that guy was not a recidivist, nor was he going to be a recidivist, probably. He was a person who engaged in a crime of opportunity. I think different ways of handling different problems is good. And we have a lot of judges that do a good job in, quote, creative sentencing. I don't, as I was saying in my remarks to Dr. Curry, I don't necessarily agree that prison is always right for every offender, for every offense. There are other factors that will enter into, and I think creative sentences allows judges to take all those factors into consideration.
I have a statement and then a question. Let me read the statement, and then any member of the panel can respond to the question. The statement is, few offer crime measures seem to have an impact on the motivation of young, violent criminal offenders. How can this motivation be reshaped through educational measures? Punishment has no effect if no reference system of values exists in the individual. Does any program exist to address this problem?
It's called parenting.
You're very right there, but there's a great segment of our urban areas that they don't have two parents, or that are parents who also had little good parenting. We know that they exist, and we know the numbers in terms of these circumstances. Yet I haven't heard any programs on parenting. We have people who don't know what good parenting is, and we need to consider those factors. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can to talk about parenting is only one aspect of the solution. I think since the superintendent had highlighted the fact that there are many children out there who don't have parents, collective responsibility is the way to go. I think most of the people in the room who are at least 30 years and above will remember the perspective of collective responsibility. You know how you would do something on your street and you would be maybe 10 houses down from your house, but by the time you got home, your parents would know exactly what had happened and admonish you as you had gotten admonished along the way home by other people. I think that that's what needs to be put in place, and that was what was in place at one time. I remember in my home, where I was fortunate enough to have two parents, other kids would come to our house, and maybe things that they wouldn't do in their home, they had to do at our house. And when I would go to their house, there were things maybe I didn't do that I had to do there. That's the collective responsibility that it's going to take for raising children. So I agree that parenting is a component, but if we understand where we are in America now, we understand what we have in place of us, then it's going to take collective responsibility also, not just parenting.
I agree with that too, and I think the real question for us again in the future, whether we are talking about the ability of parents to raise children, or we are talking about the larger responsibility of a community and its ability to help raise children, we need to do a whole lot better job of supporting people's ability to raise their kids than we do now. And I agree very much with Mr. Holmes. Parenting is absolutely essential. When you look at the research we've done on where violent juvenile delinquents come from, it's got something to do with their families and what they did not get there. But I think we can do a whole lot better job of seeing to it that they get it there than we're doing now. We have been doing an exceptionally bad job, I would say, particularly over the last 15 to 20 years. We have made it very tough on certain kinds of families to raise children in the ways we would all like to raise our own.
This one's to any and all panelists, and 3 people asked this question: is the American criminal justice system racist?
Well, you certainly, only 3 people asked that? I think we have a criminal justice system that responds to the economic injustice that exists in our country. That we, if anything, we certainly have more poor people in our system than we do well-to-do or economically sound people. So, and I guess that also then what that parlays is that economically that system does have discrimination and racism. When you look at the poverty, you look at the numbers, our people of color. So the criminal justice system is made up of people a system that is made up from the human race, from America's race. So if there's racism in the country, then there's racism in the criminal justice system. So I guess in short, the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think that if I think about the people I know who work in the criminal justice system, there aren't very many of those people that I know who I would think of as individually racist people. But I think there certainly is racism in our response to crime, at least in the following sense. Where the racism really comes in, to me, is in the neglect, is in the large-scale social neglect that underpins crime in the first place, to the extent we have it in the United States. Once you have that neglect, once you fail to do the things that you need to do in order to see to it that crime doesn't happen, that kids don't turn delinquent, that parents don't abuse their kids, once you have that level of social neglect, you are going to wind up with a lot of minority people in that criminal justice system, disproportionately so. And that's where the racism comes in. It's not so much that folks in that system are individually bigoted against people of color.
We have a question for Dr. Saunders. Do you have any numbers showing if your efforts since 1992 are paying off?
Not yet. When we started in 1992, we said that we didn't want anybody to evaluate us before the year 2000 because there's a proverb that says truth and mourning become light with time. And what we have found is that many of the violence prevention activities that have been evaluated up until this point, the research is showing that it's not working. And the reason it is because of the complexity of the issue. And it's very difficult to measure exactly what part of the issue your effort was responsible for reducing or helping to reduce the total outfit. So what we said is that we had three major objectives, and the first was to make a collaboration that worked and to make music out of noise, as I told you. The second is to continuously keep this positive messaging going on, which is what we're trying to do through the media campaign. And the third objective was to turn anecdotes into science. And what I mean by that is that there are many what we consider to be qualitative sort of data sources or qualitative information that could be anecdotally important as it relates to this issue. There's a proverb by Aesop that the story is about a mother crab who asked her son to walk straight. And the crab said to the mother, "When you do, mother, that's when I'll do it." And to this day, all of you know, the crab still walks sideways. So there are anecdotes and there are stories that we have to listen to, I believe, that we can possibly turn into the science that may be helpful to us as it relates to evaluation. But up until that point, I always tell people that if people told me that throwing salt over each shoulder and spinning around 3 times will make the violence problem disappear, I'll do it. So we have to be careful as to what we want as it relates to evaluation because the verdict is still out.
This question was asked by 5 separate people, and it reads, what is the connection between moral crisis of family breakdown and safety crisis of violent crime? Any and all members of the panel.
I thought,
I was
go ahead.
putting my paper down.
Well, I thought Dr. Curry kind of answered that in his presentation.
Maybe you can summarize it in a minute.
Well, another big question. I hope I don't sound like I'm repeating myself, but yes, I think if we want to talk about crime, we are talking about, and particularly if you're going to look at what's happened in the last 20 years or so in our country, 30 years, you've got to include the breakdown of the family in some very important sense. If you look at the trends in what's happened to families, if you look at the number of kids who are not only growing up in what are so-called broken families, but often in no families whatsoever in some of our most impacted communities, and then you look at the trends in juvenile violence, there's got to be a connection there, and I think common sense tells us that there is. I do have a problem, frankly, though, with folks who kind of want to isolate this problem as if it were simply a moral problem, and as if by kind of preaching virtue at families we could pull them all back together, or as if maybe by taking people's kids away from them we could, have a deterrent effect on this problem. I think, again, that if you want families to be able to raise children in a competent and caring way, in the kind of way that keeps them off the streets and out of your windows, keeps them from putting a gun up in your face, and keeps them out of our prisons, then we have to help families do that. We have to support their capacity to do that. And we know how to do that, I think, in a variety of ways. But as Chief Rodriguez pointed out, and Chief Moose as well, we're not making these choices. We seem to be avoiding the choices that we need to make. We pretty well know what we would need to do to make stronger families. We know a lot about how to intervene with families in trouble, but we're not putting the resources where our knowledge is.
One of the things that Dr. Curry pointed out to you all was the international variation in homicide rates. And he had explained to you, if you could see it graphically, you could see where the United States is compared to so-called industrialized nations around the world. And our rate far exceeds these other nations. And one of the things that I have been made to understand is the difference between us and other countries basically is that we preach individualism. We preach this concept of that the individual right supersedes the whole, whereas in other countries, it's the individual is a part of the whole, so your right does not supersede the whole. And I always like to use myself as an example. I raised 2 small children by myself, and people would think because I'm a single parent that I'm at high risk for violent behavior occurring in my children. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But one of the things that I have found is that the values that I instill in my children, that the greater society is not helping me to maintain those. When my kids walk out the door, they belong to the greater society. And the greater society tells them what they want to tell them. And essentially, that's what's happening in America. We argue about television. We argue about the methods that our young people are using as it relates to this type of behavior. All of that young people don't make. And as Dr. Curry has said, until we understand that it's going to take collective, that we're all saying the same thing and that we all mean the thing, no matter how the family may break down, no matter how much it may break down because of the nuances of intimate relationships, and we can go on about that forever. But the point is that until kids get the same messages, until we're all held accountable for what our young people do, then we'll never see the changes in the behavior that we want to see.
One of your members in this audience is the victim in a burglary that happened 5 o'clock this morning. And the only reason that guy was caught is because he was in a gated community where he didn't belong and made the mistake of burglarizing the house next to the DA.
But I think what we get with those gated communities is we get more communities that are isolated that simply just need the services, because what you got is the retreat inside those gated communities of all of the role models that many of our young people need to see. People that actually have shown the ability to get up in the morning and to go off to work. People that participate in that holistic community that somehow watches out for everyone else's kid. Only the kids within that gated community then benefit from those role models. All of the other kids, the ones that can't afford to be in that environment, all they see is that, people in my neighborhood don't get up and go to work. People in my neighborhood don't have jobs. People in my neighborhood have a bottle of wine for breakfast. That's the only role model that they see. And eventually, I think that what that does is lead to increasing crime, because I think we heard some data about the small percentage of Americans that actually commit crime. It's not the people in the gated community that commit the crime. It's those that are being locked out. And so what they will do is they will just do more and more crime. Instead of stealing 3 cars a day, they will start stealing 6 and 7 cars. Sooner or later, the people in the gated community have to leave the gated community, and then the predators will be there waiting.
Cover me, honey, I'm going to work.
Unfortunately, we're running out of, well, we have...
Can't stand there forever.
used all of our time for this very, very, very interesting, informative panel. There's a final question that if anyone would like to address, and it may have been covered by your respective responses, but what measures do you recommend that a community or neighborhood use to deter crime, especially violent crime?
What's the question?
Put up a gate.
What was the first part of the question?
What measures can a community...
Be aware of your circumstances. Don't engage in conduct that's foolish. We had this prosecutor from Fort Bend County killed the other day, and I thought to myself that one does not ordinarily loiter in their car at night in the urban area. Wayne Dolcefino was sitting in his convertible parked in front of his house when he was assaulted, robbed, and pistol whipped that seems to me something you could reduce the possibility of occurring. And so there are things, and these gentlemen right here, I'm sure in their own community, and I know you did when you were police chief, had a whole division that didn't do anything but go out and inform the community on little, really inexpensive things you can do to improve or reduce the risk of being a crime victim. So there are things you can do, and call upon these resources if somebody wants to, and they can be specific, even to have home inspections.
Any final comments from any other member of the panel on that question?
No, but the fastest growing industry in this country seems to be private security, and it gets back to people being concerned about crime. No matter what the crime rate is in our city, be the 5th year in a row that our major crime will be down. But if you went and asked the citizens of the city of Chicago whether violent crime was up or down, they would respond almost positively. Yeah, that it's gone up, and so that's but I think being aware of the possibilities of being a victim is very, very important. We've not done a lot in that area. We've done, we need to do much more than we have in the past.
I think that people need to remember that there's two types of crime. There's violent and nonviolent, and depending on which one you're talking about will depend on the strategies. I think there have been a lot of strategies that have been placed on the table as it relates to nonviolence. We have Crime Watch, we have more police officers, we have all those things on the streets. As it relates to the violent crime or the interpersonal violence that is involving many of our people, people are going to have to understand that the solutions are going to have to come from inward, and people are going to have to work on how they treat each other. So that's why when we talk about the concept of maybe mentoring, people should think about mentoring young people outside of the concept of a program and understand that collective mentoring, even if you have a child or a young person in your purview for 5 seconds, 5 minutes, or 5 hours, you should mentor that person. So people have to understand that the strategies are going to be different depending on what you're talking about. And I think many people in this country get confused because they don't know what they're really talking. They sort of put it all together. So there are different strategies for different things. And some of it is intervention, some of it is prevention. But mostly, I think that one thing that we should keep in mind is that we are a nation. We've proven that we can overcome issues, just like we did with the motor vehicle death rate. If you don't know, motor vehicle death rate is now down in most states. We have made it not the first or the leading cause of death. And what we did was we galvanized around the issue. Back in the 60s, when we looked at the numbers, we began to make people wear their seatbelts. We made you restrain your children properly. We put airbags in cars. We reconstructed our highways. We all worked on it, as we were all beginning to work on the smoking issue. So I think even the crime or the violence issue can be worked on by this country, and we can turn the numbers around. And so I want to leave you with a sense of hope. There is a lot out there.
I'd like to make a announcement that the Attorney General, Ms. Reno, will be here shortly, and I would ask those participating in that session to be promptly in their seats at 12:15.
Let me thank the panel for its outstanding presentation and ask you to join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you.